welcome back to our YouTube podcast, where we dive into the fascinating world of cultures and traditions. I'm Mira, and I'm super to share today's topic with you. And, of course, I'm not alone in this adventure. My trusty sidekick, Leo, is here to spice things up. Leo, what's up?
Not much. Mira, just enjoying the coffee-fueled chaos of our studio. But seriously, we've got a fantastic topic lined up for today's podcast. Get ready to learn about the incredible countries that will leave you feeling like a world traveler.
That's right. Today, we're comparing Benin and Poland, two countries that might seem worlds apart. But, trust me, they have more in common than you think. Leo, I have to ask, have you been to either of these countries?
Yes. I've had the pleasure of visiting Poland, and let me tell you, it was an amazing experience. The food, the culture, the people, everything was just fantastic. But, I must admit, I've always been curious about Benin. Maybe one day, I'll make it there and discover its secrets.
Well, today's podcast is going to be a treasure trove of information for you. Leo, we'll be diving into the history, culture, food, traditions, and so much more of both countries. And, of course, we'll be answering all your burning questions about which country is the best to visit or live in. So, get comfortable, grab a snack, and let's get started.
Don't worry, I'll try to keep my questions in check. But, seriously, Mira, this podcast is powered by the amazing team at Genoff AI, who help us bring you the best content possible. Thanks to them, we can focus on what we do best, making you laugh and learn.
Thank you, Leo. And, as we always say, laughter is the best medicine. But, in this case, it's also a great way to learn about new cultures. So, let's get started with our first topic, the history of Benin and Poland. Leo, can you give us a brief overview of what we can expect to learn today?
Absolutely. Mira, today, we'll be exploring the rich history of both countries, from ancient civilizations to modern-day cultural traditions. We'll also be discussing the cuisine, music, and art of each country, and how they've evolved over time. And, of course, we'll be answering all your questions about which country is the best to visit or live in.
That's right. And to make things even more interesting, we'll be sharing some fun facts and anecdotes about each country. So, stay tuned, folks, and get ready to learn something new and exciting. I can already feel the excitement building up.
I know, right? It's going to be a wild ride. And remember, if you have any questions or topics you'd like us to cover, feel free to leave them in the comments section below. We love hearing from our audience and responding to their queries.
That's right, Leah. And we encourage you to share your thoughts and opinions with us on social media using the hashtag Benin versus Poland. We'd love to hear your thoughts and engage in a fun conversation with you. I'm so to get started.
Me too. Mira, let's do this.
Let's dive into Benin and Poland's general safety and crime rates. I'm curious. Leo, have you ever heard of the concept of collective security in Benin?
Actually, I've read about it. Apparently, in Benin, community policing is a big deal. And they have a unique approach to crime prevention. They call it collective security, where the whole community works together to prevent crime.
That's fascinating. And I'm sure our listeners would agree that community involvement is key to reducing crime rates. But what about Poland? I've heard that they have a strong emphasis on law enforcement, with a well-organized police force.
That's true. Poland's police force is one of the most respected in Europe, and they have a strong focus on community policing as well. But what's interesting is that Poland has a relatively low crime rate compared to other European countries.
That's great to hear. And I think it's worth noting that both Benin and Poland have a strong cultural emphasis on respect for authority. In Benin, the concept of Oba or king is still revered, and the community looks up to their leaders for guidance and protection.
Exactly. And in Poland, the concept of solidarity is deeply ingrained in the culture. It's a sense of collective responsibility and mutual support that helps to reduce crime rates.
I'm certain that our listeners living in Benin would agree that the concept of Oba is a powerful symbol of community leadership. And I'm curious, Leo, what do you think is the biggest challenge facing Benin in terms of crime prevention?
Well, I think one of the biggest challenges is the issue of corruption. Corruption can undermine the effectiveness of law enforcement and community policing efforts.
That's a great point. And I think it's worth noting that both Benin and Poland have made efforts to combat corruption in recent years. In Poland, for example, there have been efforts to increase transparency and accountability in government and law enforcement.
Yes, and in Benin, there have been efforts to strengthen the rule of law and improve the efficiency of the justice system. But it's a complex issue, and it will take time and effort to address.
Absolutely. And I think it's worth noting that both countries have a strong emphasis on education and community development as a way to prevent crime. In Benin, for example, there are programs to promote literacy and vocational training, which can help to reduce crime rates.
That's a great point. And in Poland, there are also programs to promote education and job training, which can help to reduce crime rates.
I'm curious, Leo, have you ever been to Benin or Poland? What did you think of the safety situation there?
Actually, I've been to Poland, and I was impressed by the safety and security of the country. But I think it's worth noting that both Benin and Poland have their own unique safety challenges.
That's true. And I think it's worth noting that both countries have a strong emphasis on tourism and cultural exchange. In Benin, for example, there are many historical sites and cultural festivals that attract tourists.
Yes, and in Poland, there are also many historical sites and cultural festivals that attract tourists. But I think it's worth noting that both countries have their own unique cultural traditions and customs.
I'm certain that our listeners would agree that cultural exchange is a powerful way to promote understanding and respect between different communities. And I'm curious, Leo, what do you think is the most important thing that our listeners should take away from this discussion?
I think the most important thing is that both Benin and Poland have unique safety challenges, but they also have a strong emphasis on community, policing, and law enforcement. And by working together, we can create safer and more secure communities.
Absolutely. And I think it's worth noting that both countries have a strong emphasis on respect for authority and community leadership. And by promoting education and community development, we can help to reduce crime rates and create a safer and more secure future.
That's a great point. And I think it's worth noting that both Benin and Poland have a strong emphasis on cultural exchange and tourism, which can help to promote understanding and respect between different communities.
I'm curious, Leo, what do you think our listeners should do if they're planning to visit Benin or Poland? What safety tips would you recommend?
Well, I think it's always a good idea to research the local safety situation and take necessary precautions. But I also think that both Benin and Poland are generally safe countries to visit. And with some common sense and caution, visitors can have a safe and enjoyable trip.
That's great advice, Leo. And I think it's worth noting that both countries have a strong emphasis on community policing and law enforcement, which can help to ensure visitor safety.
Yes, and I think it's worth noting that both Benin and Poland have a strong emphasis on cultural exchange and tourism, which can help to promote understanding and respect between different communities.
I'm certain that our listeners would agree that cultural exchange is a powerful way to promote understanding and respect between different communities. And I'm curious, Leo, what do you think is the biggest misconception about Benin and Poland in terms of safety?
I think one of the biggest misconceptions is that both countries are extremely safe. While they do have a strong emphasis on community policing and law enforcement, they also have their own unique safety challenges.
That's a great point. And I think it's worth noting that both countries have a strong emphasis on education and community development as a way to prevent crime.
Yes, and I think it's worth noting that both Benin and Poland have a strong emphasis on cultural exchange and tourism, which can help to promote understanding and respect between different communities.
I'm curious. Leo, what do you think our listeners should take away from this discussion of Benin and Poland's general safety and crime rates?
I think the most important thing is that both countries have unique safety challenges, but they also have a strong emphasis on community policing and law enforcement. And by working together, we can create safer and more secure communities.
Absolutely. And I think it's worth noting that both countries have a strong emphasis on respect for authority and community. And by promoting education and community development, we can help to reduce crime rates and create a safer and more secure future.
That's a great point. And I think it's worth noting that both Benin and Poland have a strong emphasis on cultural exchange and tourism, which can help to promote understanding and respect between different communities.
I'm certain that our listeners would agree that cultural exchange is a powerful way to promote understanding and respect between different communities. And I'm curious. Leo, what do you think is the best way to stay safe in Benin or Poland?
I think the best way is to be aware of your surroundings. Research the local safety.
Tap into the world of politics and social harmony in Benin and Poland. I'm curious to see how these two countries handle governance and community relations.
Great topic. Benin, being a presidential republic, has a unique system where the president serves as both head of state and head of government. It's fascinating to see how this setup affects social harmony.
I see what you mean. And Poland, as a parliamentary republic, has a more complex system with a president and a prime minister. But what's interesting is how these systems impact the overall stability of the country.
Exactly. And I think it's worth noting that Benin has a relatively stable political environment, with a strong tradition of democratic governance. But, of course, there are always challenges to navigate.
That's true. And Poland, on the other hand, has experienced its share of political turmoil in recent years. But, overall, it's considered a stable democracy.
Yeah, and I think that's because of the strong civil society and the rule of law in Poland. It's a great example of how a country can maintain stability despite challenges.
Absolutely. And I think it's also worth mentioning that both countries have a strong sense of community and social cohesion. People in Benin and Poland seem to really look out for one another.
That's so true. And I think that's reflected in the way people interact with each other in both countries. It's a really warm and welcoming atmosphere.
I'm certain that our listeners living in Benin would agree with me that the sense of community is incredibly strong there.
And I'm sure our listeners in Poland would agree that the social harmony in the country is due in large part to the strong tradition of family and community ties.
Well, it's clear that both countries have a lot to offer when it comes to social harmony. But, of course, there are also challenges to navigate.
Absolutely. And I think that's where the concept of Ubuntu comes in. It's an African philosophy that emphasizes the importance of community and interdependence.
I love that concept. And I think it's really relevant to both Benin and Poland. It's all about recognizing that we're all in this together.
Exactly. And I think that's what makes both countries so special. They have a deep understanding of the importance of community and social harmony.
Well, I think we've just scratched the surface of this topic. But I'm curious to hear from our listeners, what do you think is the key to social harmony in Benin and Poland?
Great question. And I think it's worth noting that both countries have a strong sense of history and cultural heritage. That's really important for building social harmony.
Absolutely. And I think it's also worth mentioning that both countries have a strong tradition of education and intellectual curiosity.
That's so true. And I think that's reflected in the way people engage with each other in both countries. It's a really stimulating and enriching atmosphere.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground today. But I'm sure our listeners will have plenty more to say on this topic.
Absolutely. And I think it's worth noting that both countries have a lot to offer when it comes to social harmony, whether you're an expat or just visiting. Both Benin and Poland are great destinations.
For more insights like this, don't forget to check out Jetta. They have some fantastic resources on cultural intelligence and global citizenship.
And I think we should also give a shout out to our listeners who are living in Benin and Poland. Keep on sharing your experiences and insights with us.
Thanks for tuning in. Everyone, until next time, stay curious and keep on exploring. So, let's talk about economic conditions and cost of living in Benin and Poland. I'm curious, Leo, have you ever heard of Benin's unique economic model?
Actually, I have. Benin's economy is heavily reliant on agriculture, with cotton and cashews being major exports. But what's interesting is that they're also investing in renewable energy, like solar and wind power. It's like a breath of fresh air in the African economic scene.
That's fascinating. And Poland, on the other hand, has a more developed economy, with a strong focus on industry and manufacturing. I'm sure our listeners would agree that it's a great place to find affordable goods.
Absolutely. Poland's economy is a mix of state-owned and private enterprises, with a strong emphasis on exports, particularly in the automotive and electronics sectors. But did you know that Poland also has a growing startup scene, with many innovative companies popping up in major cities like Warsaw and Krakow?
Well, that's impressive. I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the cost of living in both countries. What are some general observations about the cost of living in Benin? Leo?
Well, Benin is generally a very affordable country, with low prices for food, transportation, and accommodation. However, the cost of living can vary greatly depending on the region and city. For example, in the capital city of Porto Novo, prices are slightly higher than in other parts of the country.
I see. And what about Poland? How does it compare to Benin in terms of cost of living?
Poland is actually one of the more expensive countries in Eastern Europe, especially when it comes to accommodation and food. However, the cost of living can vary greatly depending on the city and region. For example, Warsaw and Krakow tend to be more expensive than smaller cities like Rock or Poznan.
That makes sense. And what about the job market in both countries? Are there any significant differences between Benin and Poland?
Actually, Poland has a relatively high unemployment rate, especially among young people. But the job market is still strong, with many opportunities in industries like IT, finance, and healthcare. Benin, on the other hand, has a relatively low unemployment rate, but the job market is more limited, with many people working in the informal sector.
I see. So what advice would you give to our listeners who are considering moving to either Benin or Poland? What are some general tips for navigating the economic conditions and cost of living in each country?
I think it's essential to research thoroughly and understand the local economy, job market, and cost of living before making a decision. Also, it's crucial to be flexible and adaptable, as both countries have their unique challenges and opportunities.
Great advice. Leah. And finally, I'm curious. What do you think is the most significant difference between Benin and Poland in terms of economic conditions and cost of living?
That's a tough one. But I think one of the most significant differences is the level of economic development and infrastructure in each country. Poland has a more developed economy and infrastructure, while Benin is still developing its economy and infrastructure.
I see what you mean. And what about our listeners? What do you think is the most significant difference between Benin and Poland in terms of economic conditions and cost of living?
I think our listeners would agree that it's essential to research thoroughly and understand the local economy, job market, and cost of living before making a decision. And also, be prepared for the unexpected, as both countries have their unique challenges and opportunities.
Well, there you have it. Folks, I hope our listeners found this comparison of economic conditions and cost of living in Benin and Poland informative and helpful. And don't forget to share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below.
Absolutely. And remember, when it comes to economic conditions and cost of living, it's all about being informed and adaptable. Happy travels. and we'll see you in the next episode.
So, into the world of accommodation, options, and quality in Benin and Poland. I'm curious, Leo, what's the first thing that comes to mind when you think of housing in these countries?
Well, Mira, I think it's safe to say that Benin's colonial past has left an interesting mark on its architecture. I mean, have you seen the old French colonial buildings in Cotonou? They're like something out of a movie.
Oh, yes, I've seen those too. But let's get serious for a moment. In terms of affordability, what can our listeners expect in Benin?
Good question. Mira, I'd say that Benin has a relatively affordable housing market, especially when compared to some of the other countries in West Africa. However, the quality of housing can vary greatly depending on the location and the type of property.
That's true. I've heard that in some areas, you can find beautiful, old colonial homes that have been restored. But in other areas, the housing is more, let's say, basic.
Basic is a nice way of putting it, Mira. But seriously, the housing market in Benin is quite diverse, and it really depends on what you're looking for.
I'm certain that our listeners living in this country would agree with me that the housing market can be a bit chaotic, especially for foreigners. So, let's move on to Poland. What can our listeners expect in terms of accommodation options and quality?
Poland. Now, that's a country with a rich history and a thriving housing market. I mean, have you seen the old town centers in cities like Krakow and Warsaw? They're like something out of a fairy tale.
Yes, Poland has a lot to offer in terms of architecture and history. But let's get down to business. In terms of affordability, what can our listeners expect in Poland?
Well, Mira, I think it's safe to say that Poland has a relatively high standard of living, and the housing market reflects that. However, it's still possible to find affordable options, especially outside of the major cities.
That's true. I've heard that in some areas, you can find beautiful, old apartments that have been restored. But in other areas, the housing is more, let's say, expensive.
Expensive is a nice way of putting it, Mira. But seriously, the housing market in Poland is quite competitive, and prices can vary greatly depending on the location and the type of property.
I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Do you think it's fair to say that the housing market in Poland is more expensive than in Benin?
That's a tough question. Mira, I think it really depends on what our listeners are looking for. If they're looking for a luxurious apartment in a major city, then yes, Poland might be more expensive. But if they're looking for a more affordable option, then Benin might be a better choice.
That's a great point. Leo, and let's be real. The cost of living in Poland is generally higher than in Benin. So, what can our listeners expect in terms of housing costs?
Well, Mira, I think it's safe to say that housing costs in Poland are generally higher than in Benin. However, it's still possible to find affordable options, especially outside of the major cities.
I'm certain that our listeners would agree with me that the cost of living in Poland can be a bit of a challenge, especially for foreigners. But let's not forget that Poland has a lot to offer in terms of culture and history.
That's true, Mira. And let's not forget that Poland has a thriving expat community, which can make it easier for foreigners to navigate the housing market.
That's a great point, Leo. And let's be real. The housing market in Poland is quite diverse, and it really depends on what our listeners are looking for.
Well, Mira, I think we've covered a lot of ground in this conversation, but I'm sure our listeners have a lot of questions about the housing market in Benin and Poland.
That's true, Leo. And I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about their experiences with the housing market in these countries. So, let's open it up to our listeners. Do you have any questions or comments about the housing market in Benin and Poland?
Yes. And let's not forget to answer some of the questions that our listeners have been asking us.
That's right. And let's let's keep the conversation going. We'd love to hear from you in the comments. Chime into the world of visas, immigration, and official procedures in Benin and Poland. I'm curious, Leo, have you ever had to navigate the complexities of getting a visa for either country?
Yes. I have. Mira, and let me tell you, it's been a wild ride. But seriously, both countries have their own unique challenges when it comes to obtaining a visa. In Benin, for example, the process is relatively straightforward, but it can take a few weeks to a few months to get approved.
That's true. Leo, I've heard that Benin's visa process is quite efficient, but it's still a bureaucratic nightmare. But what about Poland? Leo? I've heard that their visa process is much more complex.
Yes. Poland is a different story altogether. The process is much more lengthy and involves a lot of paperwork. But I've found that it's worth it in the end, as Poland has a lot to offer expats.
I agree. Leo, Poland is a beautiful country with a rich history and culture. But I'm curious, what's the most difficult part of getting a visa for Poland?
Well, Mira, I think it's the language barrier. As an non-EU citizen, you need to demonstrate a certain level of proficiency in Polish to get a visa. And, let me tell you, it's not easy to get a Polish language certificate.
I see. That makes sense. But what about our listeners who are living in Benin or Poland? I'm sure they'd love to share their experiences with us.
Yes. Let's hear from them. I'm sure they have some valuable insights to share. And I'm curious. Mira, what do you think is the most common mistake that people make when applying for a visa in either country?
Well, I think it's a lack of preparation. People often don't do their research and don't understand the requirements for a visa. But I'm sure our listeners will have some tips to share with us.
Yes. I'm sure they will. And I'm curious. Mira, what's the best way to navigate the visa process in either country?
Well, I think it's to work with a reputable visa agency or attorney. They can guide you through the process and make sure you have all the necessary documents.
That's a great tip. Mira, and I'm sure our listeners will appreciate it. But what about the cost of getting a visa in either country? I've heard that it can be quite expensive.
Yes, that's true. The cost of getting a visa in either country can be quite high. But I think it's worth it in the end, as it can open up a lot of opportunities for expats.
I agree. Mira. And I'm curious, what do you think is the most important thing to consider when applying for a visa in either country?
Well, I think it's to make sure you have all the necessary documents and to do your research. And, of course, to work with a reputable visa agency or attorney.
That's great advice, Mira, and I'm sure our listeners will appreciate it. But what about the process of getting a residence permit in either country? I've heard that it can be quite complex.
Yes, that's true. The process of getting a residence permit in either country can be quite lengthy and involves a lot of paperwork. But I think it's worth it in the end, as it can provide a lot of stability for expats.
I agree. Mira, and I'm curious, what do you think is the best way to navigate the process of getting a residence permit in either country?
Well, I think it's to work with a reputable agency or attorney who specializes in immigration law. They can guide you through the process and make sure you have all the necessary documents.
That's a great tip. Mira, and I'm sure our listeners will appreciate it. But what about the cost of getting a residence permit in either country? I've heard that it can be quite high.
Yes, that's true. The cost of getting a residence permit in either country can be quite high. But I think it's worth it in the end, as it can provide a lot of stability for expats.
I agree. Mira, and I'm curious, what do you think is the most important thing to consider when applying for a residence permit in either country?
Well, I think it's to make sure you have all the necessary documents and to do your research. Of course, to work with a reputable agency or attorney.
Ah, that's great advice, Mira. And I'm sure our listeners will appreciate it. But what about the process of getting a work permit in either country? I've heard that it can be quite complex.
Oh, yes, that's true. The process of getting a work permit in either country can be quite lengthy and involves a lot of paperwork. But I think it's worth it in the end, as it can provide a lot of opportunities for expats.
Ah, I agree. Mira, and I'm curious, what do you think is the best way to navigate the process of getting a work permit in either country?
Well, I think it's to work with a reputable agency or attorney who specializes in immigration law. They can guide you through the process and make sure you have all the necessary documents.
Ah, that's a great tip, Mira. And I'm sure our listeners will appreciate it. But what about the cost of getting a work permit in either country? I've heard that it can be quite high.
Ah, yes, that's true. The cost of getting a work permit in either country can be quite high. But I think it's worth it in the end, as it can provide a lot of opportunities for expats.
Ah, I agree, Mira. And I'm curious, what do you think is the most important thing to consider when applying for a work permit in either country?
Well, I think it's to make sure you have all the necessary documents and to do your research. And, of course, to work with a reputable agency or attorney.
Ah, that's great advice, Mira. And I'm sure our listeners will appreciate it. But what about the process of getting a digital nomad visa in either country? I've heard that it's becoming more popular.
Oh, yes, that's true. The process of getting a digital nomad visa in either country can be quite lengthy and involves a. So, when it comes to healthcare, Benin and Poland have some interesting differences. In Benin, the healthcare system is primarily based on traditional medicine, with a mix of modern and traditional practices.
Yes. And in Poland, the system is more westernized, with a strong emphasis on modern medicine.
Exactly. And that shows in the quality of care. In Poland, you'll find well-equipped hospitals and a high standard of medical training.
That's true. But Benin has made some great strides in recent years, investing in new healthcare infrastructure and training more medical professionals.
I'm curious, have our listeners who live in Benin ever had to deal with a serious medical issue while abroad?
Actually, yes. I know of someone who had a heart attack while traveling in Benin and received excellent care at a local hospital.
Wow, that's great to hear. And in Poland, what's the situation like for foreigners seeking medical care?
Well, Poland has a well-established system for foreigners, with many hospitals and clinics catering to international patients.
That's reassuring to know. Now, let's talk about the cultural nuances of healthcare in these two countries. In Benin, traditional medicine plays a big role, with many people relying on herbal remedies and spiritual healers.
And in Poland, you'll find a strong emphasis on scientific medicine, with a focus on evidence-based treatment.
Exactly. But it's interesting to note that in both countries, there's a growing recognition of the importance of mental health.
That's true. And both Benin and Poland have made efforts to improve mental health services and reduce stigma around mental illness.
I'm sure our listeners would agree that mental health is just as important as physical health.
Absolutely. And it's great to see both countries taking steps to address this issue.
Now let's talk about the cost of healthcare in these two countries. In Benin, healthcare is generally quite affordable, with many medical services available at a low cost.
That's true. But in Poland, the cost of healthcare can be quite high, especially for foreigners who don't have health insurance.
Ah, yes, that's a good point. And what about the available health insurance in these countries?
In Poland, health insurance is mandatory for all residents. But in Benin, it's not as widespread.
That's interesting. I'm sure our listeners would like to know more about the healthcare system in Benin and Poland.
Absolutely. And I think it's great that we're having this conversation to raise awareness about the different healthcare systems in these countries.
Well, I think that's a great note to end on. And to our listeners, we'd love to hear your thoughts on this topic. Do you have any experience with healthcare in Benin or Poland?
Yes, and I think it's great that we can have this conversation and learn from each other's experiences.
So, let's dive into transportation, infrastructure, and convenience in Benin and Poland. We'll explore public transit stats, road quality, and traveler experiences to uncover each country's unique transport challenges and how they enable seamless movement.
I'm to share some of the more interesting aspects of transportation in these countries. Benin, for instance, has a relatively underdeveloped public transit system, but it's also surprisingly efficient in some areas.
That's right. In Benin, you'll often see motorbikes and taxis filling the streets. It's a bit chaotic, but it gets people where they need to go. I bet our listeners in Benin can relate to this traffic chaos.
Yeah, it's definitely a unique experience. In Poland, on the other hand, you'll find a more developed public transit system, with buses and trains connecting major cities.
Exactly. And the trains in Poland are quite impressive. I took a train from Warsaw to Krakow and was amazed by the scenic views and comfortable seating. It was a great way to see the countryside.
Yeah, Polish trains are definitely a highlight. But what about road quality? Benin has some of the worst roads in the world, while Poland's roads are generally much better.
That's true. In Benin, you'll often encounter old roads and uneven surfaces. But, as I said, the motorbikes and taxis can navigate these roads with ease. It's a testament to the resourcefulness of Beninese drivers.
Yeah, it's impressive. In Poland, you'll find more modern roads, but they can still be prone to congestion during rush hour.
I see what you mean. But Poland's public transit system helps alleviate some of that congestion. I took a bus from Krakow to Zakopane and was by how easy it was to get around.
Yeah, Polish buses are quite efficient. But what about traveler experiences? What's it like to navigate transportation in Benin and Poland?
Well, in Benin, you'll often need to rely on local guides or taxi drivers to get around. It can be a bit overwhelming, but it's also a great way to experience the local culture.
That's true. In Poland, you'll find more tourist-friendly transportation options. But it's still essential to research and plan ahead to avoid any language barriers.
Exactly. And speaking of language barriers, I had to learn some basic Polish phrases to navigate the train system. It was a challenge, but it made the experience more rewarding.
Yeah, language skills can go a long way in Poland. But what about the environmental impact of transportation in these countries? How do Benin and Poland compare in terms of sustainable transportation options?
That's a great question. In Benin, you'll find a growing number of electric motor bicycles, which is a great step towards sustainability.
Yeah, Benin is definitely leading the way in sustainable transportation. In Poland, you'll find more traditional public transit options, but there's also a growing interest in electric vehicles and cycling.
That's right. And speaking of cycling, I took a bike tour in Warsaw and was by how bike-friendly the city is.
Yeah, Polish cities are definitely getting more bike-friendly. But what about the cost of transportation in these countries? How do Benin and Poland compare in terms of affordability?
That's a great question. In Benin, you often find affordable transportation options, but they can be unpredictable. In Poland, you'll find more modern public transit systems, but they can be pricier.
That's true. In Poland, you'll need to budget for public transit, but it's still relatively affordable compared to other European countries.
I see what you mean. But what about the future of transportation in Benin and Poland? How do these countries plan to improve their transportation infrastructure?
That's a great question. In Benin, there are plans to develop a more modern public transit system, including a new bus rapid transit system.
That's exciting to hear. In Poland, you'll find a more developed public transit system, but there's still a need for investment in sustainable transportation options.
That's right. And speaking of investment, I bet our listeners have some great ideas for improving transportation in these countries. If you've got a better transit hack, drop a comment.
Yeah, let's hear from our listeners. And finally, what's the most memorable transportation experience you've had in Benin or Poland?
That's a great question. For me, it was taking a train from Warsaw to Krakow and seeing the scenic views of the Polish countryside.
Yeah, Polish trains are definitely a highlight. And for me, it was taking a motorbike taxi through the streets of Cotonou and Benin.
Yeah, that's definitely a unique experience. Well, that's all the time we have for today's topic. Thanks for joining us, everyone.
Thanks for tuning in. Everyone, don't forget to subscribe to our podcast and follow us on social media for more travel tips and stories from Benin and Poland. So, let's dive into the world of languages in Benin and Poland. I'm curious. Leo, have you ever tried to navigate the local language in either country?
Oh, absolutely. In Benin, I had to use a combination of French and Defo to get by. While in Poland, I relied on my rusty high school Polish to order a decent pierogi. It's amazing how a few phrases can make all the difference.
That's so true. In Benin, you can find around 50 languages spoken, but French is the official language. Can you imagine trying to navigate that many dialects?
Yeah, it's like trying to learn a new language every day. But I have to say, the Beninese people are incredibly patient and willing to help foreigners communicate.
I'm sure they are. And in Poland, you have Polish as the official language, but many people also speak English, especially in tourist areas. How did you find the language barrier in Poland?
Well, it was definitely easier than in Benin, but I still had to rely on hand gestures and body language to get by. And let me tell you, the Polish people are very proud of their language, so I had to be careful not to make any mistakes.
I can imagine. So, what's the most common language spoken in Benin, besides French?
That would be FON, which is spoken by around 1.5 million people. But I've also heard that many people speak Yoruba and other languages, especially in the north.
That's fascinating. And in Poland, what's the most common language spoken besides Polish?
Well, English is widely spoken, especially among the younger population. But you can also find many people speaking German, especially in the western regions.
That's great to know. So, what's the best way to learn a new language? In your opinion, Leo?
Well, I think the best way is to immerse yourself in the language and culture. Try to speak with locals, listen to music, and watch TV shows or movies in the target language.
Absolutely. And, for our listeners, I'm curious, how do you approach language learning? Do you have any tips or tricks to share?
Well, I think the most important thing is to be consistent and persistent. Don't be afraid to make mistakes, and try to find a language exchange partner or tutor to help you improve.
That's so true. And speaking of language exchange, I've heard that Poland has a great language exchange program, where you can find language partners and practice your language skills.
Yes. Poland has a wonderful language exchange program, and many universities also offer language courses for foreigners. It's a great way to improve your language skills and connect with locals.
That's fantastic. And finally, what's the most important thing to remember when communicating in a foreign language?
I think the most important thing is to be respectful, open-minded. Don't be afraid to ask for help. And try to learn a few basic phrases in the local language to show your appreciation for the culture.
Well said, Leo. And for our listeners, I'm sure you'll agree that communication is key to any successful experience, whether it's traveling or living abroad.
Absolutely. And if you have any tips or stories to share about language learning or communication, please let us know in the comments below.
And don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel for more exciting content and discussions about Benin and Poland. I'm fascinated by Benin's cultural tapestry, with over 40 ethnic groups and 60 languages spoken. It's like a rich quilt of diversity, don't you think, Leo?
Indeed. Mira. And what I find intriguing is how Benin's cultural diversity is not just about numbers, but also about the way people live together. I mean, in a country with such a high population density, you'd expect tensions to rise, but instead, there's a remarkable sense of harmony.
That's right, Leo. And it's not just about coexisting. It's about embracing and celebrating each other's differences. I'm reminded of the Aida textile tradition, where artisans from different regions come together to create these stunning, intricately patterned fabrics.
Oh, yes, the Adai. I've seen those beautiful textiles. Mira. And what's remarkable is how they're not just a form of artistic expression, but also a symbol of the country's rich cultural heritage. I'm curious. Have you noticed any similarities between Benin's cultural diversity and Poland's?
Actually, Leo, I think there are some interesting parallels. Both countries have a strong tradition of folk music and dance, and both have a deep respect for their cultural heritage. But what I find particularly fascinating is how Poland has been working to preserve its cultural diversity, even in the face of historical challenges.
That's a great point. Mira, Poland's cultural diversity is indeed a remarkable story, especially considering its complex history. I mean, from the medieval times to the present day, Poland has been shaped by various cultures and influences, from the Slavic tribes to the Germanic and Austro-Hungarian empires.
Exactly, Leo. And it's not just about the historical context. It's about how Poland has managed to maintain its cultural identity despite all these external influences. I'm reminded of the beautiful town of Krakow, with its stunning architecture and vibrant cultural scene.
Ah, Krakow. What a wonderful city. Mira. And I think what's remarkable about Poland's cultural diversity is how it's not just about the big cities. It's about the smaller towns and villages, where you find these incredible traditions and customs that are still very much alive today.
That's so true, Leo. And I think it's this grassroots level of cultural diversity that really makes Poland special. I mean, where else can you find a country where you can experience the vibrant city life of Warsaw, but also the traditional folk music and dance of the countryside?
Well, Mira, I think you're selling Poland short. We've got some amazing cities, like Gdańsk and Poznan, that are just bursting with cultural energy. But what I think you're getting at is the importance of preserving cultural diversity, not just for its own sake, but also for the benefit of society as a whole.
Exactly. And I think that's something that both Benin and Poland are doing really well. I mean, by preserving their cultural heritage and promoting cultural diversity, they're not just enriching their own societies, but also contributing to the global cultural landscape.
Well said, Mira. And I think it's worth noting that cultural diversity is not just about preserving the past. It's also about embracing the present and looking to the future. I mean, in both Benin and Poland, you're seeing a new generation of artists, musicians, and performers who are pushing the boundaries of what's possible.
That's so true, Leo. And I think it's this creative energy that's really cultural diversity forward in both countries. I mean, where else can you find a country where you can experience the vibrant music and dance of the Benin's folk traditions, but also the modern art and design of Poland's contemporary scene?
Well, Mira, I think you're making me want to visit both countries even more. But seriously, cultural diversity is not just about the art and culture. It's about the people, the communities, and the way they live together.
Exactly. And I think that's something that our listeners can relate to, especially those who are living in countries with diverse cultural backgrounds. I mean, how do you think our listeners can apply the principles of cultural diversity and tolerance in their own lives?
Well, Mira, I think it's about being open-minded, curious, and respectful. I mean, by embracing our differences and learning from each other, we can build stronger, more harmonious communities.
That's so true, Leo. And I think it's also about being aware of our own biases and assumptions, and being willing to challenge them. I mean, by doing so, we can create a more inclusive and equitable society for everyone.
Well said, Mira. And I think it's worth noting that cultural diversity is not just a Western concept. It's a universal value that can be applied in any culture, anywhere in the world.
That's right, Leo. And I think it's something that both Benin and Poland are demonstrating through their own unique cultural traditions and customs. I mean, where else can you find a country where you can experience the vibrant music and dance of the Benin's Benin traditions, but also the rich cultural heritage of Poland's medieval past?
Well, Mira, I think you're making me want to visit both countries even more. But seriously, cultural diversity is not just about the past. It's about the present and the future. I mean, by embracing our differences and promoting cultural diversity, we can build a more harmonious, more equitable society for everyone.
That's so true. And I think it's something that our listeners can take away from this conversation, especially those who are living in countries with diverse cultural backgrounds. I mean, how can we apply the principles of cultural diversity and tolerance in our own lives?
Well, Mira, I think it's about being open-minded, curious, and respectful. I mean, by embracing our differences and learning from each other, we can build stronger, more harmonious communities. And I think that's something that both Benin and Poland are demonstrating through their own unique cultural traditions and customs.
That's right, Leo. And I think it's something that our listeners can relate to, especially those who are living in countries with diverse cultural backgrounds. I mean, how do you think our listeners can apply the principles of cultural diversity and tolerance in their own lives?
Well, Mira, I think it's about being aware of our own biases and assumptions, and being willing to challenge them. I mean, by doing so, we can create a more inclusive and equitable society for everyone.
That's so true, Leo. And I think it's also about being aware of our own privilege and power, and using that to promote cultural diversity and tolerance. I mean, by doing so, we can create a more just and equitable society for everyone. Benin, a country rich in cultural heritage, has made significant strides in education, especially in literacy rates. With a focus on primary education, the government has implemented programs to increase access to quality education.
That's impressive, Mira. But how does Benin compare to Poland in terms of education? Poland has a well-established system, with a strong emphasis on vocational training and higher education.
Actually, Poland's vocational training programs are quite innovative. They offer apprenticeships and internships, allowing students to gain hands-on experience in their chosen field. I'm curious, have you heard about any successful stories from Polish students who have completed these programs?
Ah, yes. I've heard that many Polish students have gone on to start their own businesses, thanks to the skills they gain through these vocational programs. It's a great way to prepare students for the workforce and encourage entrepreneurship.
That's fantastic. Benin also has a strong focus on vocational training, that, with a more rural twist, they're promoting skills like agriculture and craftsmanship, which are essential for local communities. I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about these initiatives.
Absolutely. I'm sure our listeners would be interested in learning more about the unique approaches to education in Benin. Perhaps we could delve deeper into the cultural significance of education in Benin and how it's shaped by the country's history and traditions.
That's a great idea. Leo, education is indeed a vital part of Benin's cultural identity. The country's rich history and colonial past have influenced the way education is approached, with a focus on preserving traditional knowledge and skills.
I see what you mean. Poland, on the other hand, has a more complex history when it comes to education. The country has experienced periods of significant change and upheaval, which has impacted the education system. But it's also led to a strong emphasis on education as a means of social mobility.
That's so true. Leo, education has been a key factor in Poland's economic development and social progress. But I'm curious, what about language acquisition in Poland? How do Polish students learn foreign languages? And what opportunities are available for language learners?
Ah, great question. Mira, Poland has a strong focus on language education, with many students learning English, French, and German. There are also numerous language schools and programs available for both native and non-native speakers.
That's fantastic. Benin also has a growing interest in language education, with many schools offering English and French as second languages. But I'm curious, what about the challenges faced by language learners in Benin? How do they overcome the difficulties of learning a new language?
Ah, that's a great point. Mira, language learning can be a significant challenge, especially in a country with multiple languages spoken. But I've heard that many Beninese students are highly motivated to learn new languages, and they often use innovative methods to overcome the challenges.
I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about these innovative methods. Perhaps we could discuss some of the creative approaches to language learning in Benin and Poland.
That's a great idea. Mira, I'm sure our listeners would find it fascinating to learn about the unique approaches to language education in these two countries.
I'm curious, have you ever been to a place where the temperature changes dramatically within a single day? Benin, for example, experiences a tropical savanna climate with two distinct seasons: a dry season from November to March, and a wet season from April to October. Leo, what do you think about the temperature fluctuations in Benin?
Oh, yes. I've been to Benin, and it's indeed a fascinating place. The temperature can soar to 30 degrees Celsius during the dry season, while the wet season brings heavy rainfall and temperatures around 25 degrees Celsius. But let's talk about Poland, shall we? Poland has a temperate climate with four distinct seasons. In the winter, it can get as cold as 5 degrees Celsius in the north, while the summers can be quite warm, around 25 degrees Celsius.
That's a big temperature difference. I'm sure our listeners living in Poland would agree with me that the winter months can be quite harsh. But Benin, on the other hand, has a more consistent temperature throughout the year. I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Do you think the temperature fluctuations in Benin are more manageable than in Poland?
Ah, good question. Yeah, I think it's interesting that Benin's temperature is more consistent. But it's also worth noting that the dry season can be quite hot and humid. Meanwhile, Poland's temperature fluctuations are more extreme, but the cold winters are often followed by mild springs and autumns. It's a trade-off, really.
That's a great point. Leo, I think it's also worth mentioning that Benin's wet season can be quite challenging for farmers and crops. The heavy rainfall can lead to flooding and soil erosion, which can impact food security. On the other hand, Poland's climate is more suited for agriculture, with fertile soil and moderate temperatures.
Exactly. Poland's climate is ideal for growing crops like potatoes, wheat, and rye. But Benin's climate is more challenging, and farmers have to adapt to the wet season by using techniques like terracing and contour farming. It's fascinating to see how different cultures adapt to their environments.
I completely agree. Leo, and speaking of adaptation, I think it's worth mentioning that both Benin and Poland have unique traditional practices related to climate and seasons. In Benin, for example, the FON people have a tradition of celebrating the dry season with music and dance. Meanwhile, in Poland, the winter months are often marked with traditional festivals like Wigilia and Switanoc.
Ah, wonderful examples. Mira, I think it's great that we're highlighting these cultural traditions. It's a great way to appreciate the diversity of human experience and the ways in which people adapt to their environments. And I'm sure our listeners would love to learn more about these traditions.
Absolutely. Leo, I think it's also worth noting that both Benin and Poland have unique natural attractions related to climate and seasons. In Benin, for example, the Penjori National Park is a great place to see the effects of the wet season on the environment. Meanwhile, in Poland, the Tatra Mountains offer breathtaking scenery during the summer months.
Excellent suggestions. Mira, I think it's great that we're highlighting these natural attractions. It's a great way to appreciate the beauty of both countries and the unique experiences they offer.
And finally, I think it's worth mentioning that both Benin and Poland have a strong focus on sustainability and environmental conservation. In Benin, for example, the government has implemented programs to reduce deforestation and promote ecotourism. Meanwhile, in Poland, the government has implemented policies to reduce carbon emissions and promote renewable energy.
Ah, wonderful examples. Mira, I think it's great that we're highlighting these efforts towards sustainability. It's a great way to appreciate the commitment of both countries to protecting the environment and promoting eco-friendly practices.
And there you have it. Third, a comparison of climate and seasonal conditions in Benin and Poland. We hope you enjoyed this episode and learned something new about these two fascinating countries. I'm curious about the culinary scene in Benin. I've heard that the traditional dish, the kura, is a staple in many households. Can you tell me more about it? Leah?
Akura. Yes. It's a fritter made from mashed beans, onions, and spices. But what's interesting is that it's often served with a side of sauce, which can range from simple to complex. In Benin, you'll find a variety of sauces, like peanut sauce or tomato sauce, but also more unique ones like sauce made from the baobab fruit.
Wow, that's fascinating. I love learning about new foods and ingredients. And speaking of unique ingredients, I've heard that Benin is home to the famous baobab tree. Can you tell me more about its significance in Benin's cuisine?
Yes. The baobab tree is a treasure trove of culinary delights. The leaves, seeds, and even the fruit are all used in different dishes. In fact, the baobab fruit is a great source of vitamins and minerals, and it's often used in traditional medicine as well.
That's amazing. I've always been interested in traditional medicine and the use of plants in healing. And speaking of traditional medicine, I'm curious about the role of food in Benin's cultural practices. Can you tell me more about the importance of food in Benin's traditional medicine?
Yes. In Benin, food is not just a source of sustenance, but also a way to connect with the spiritual and ancestral world. Many traditional dishes are believed to have healing properties, and food is often used as a way to communicate with the spirits.
I'm intrigued by this connection between food and spirituality. And speaking of spiritual connections, I'm curious about the role of food in Benin's cultural festivals and celebrations. Can you tell me more about the significance of food in these events?
Yes. In Benin, food plays a central role in many cultural festivals and celebrations. For example, during the Voodoo festival, traditional dishes like a karan fufu are served to honor the spirits. The food is often prepared in a special way to ensure that it's pure and free of evil spirits.
Wow, that's fascinating. I've never heard of a festival dedicated to honoring spirits. And speaking of festivals, I'm curious about the role of food in Poland's cultural celebrations. Can you tell me more about the traditional dishes served during Poland's festivals?
Yes. In Poland, traditional dishes like pierogi and bigos are often served during festivals and celebrations. But what's interesting is that these dishes have a long history and are often tied to specific cultural and historical events.
I'm intrigued by the connection between food and history in Poland. And speaking of historical connections, I'm curious about the impact of Polish cuisine on the world. Can you tell me more about Poland's contribution to global cuisine?
Yes. Poland has had a significant impact on global cuisine, particularly in the area of Eastern European cuisine. Many traditional Polish dishes like pierogi and stuffed cabbage rolls have been adopted and adapted by other cultures.
That's fascinating. I've always been interested in the exchange of culinary ideas between cultures. And speaking of cultural exchange, I'm curious about the influence of international cuisine on Benin's food scene. Can you tell me more about the impact of foreign cuisine on Benin's traditional dishes?
Yes. In Benin, you'll find a mix of traditional and international cuisine. Many foreign dishes like pizza and kebabs have been adapted to suit local tastes. And Benin's traditional dishes have also been influenced by foreign cuisine.
I'm intrigued by the blending of traditional and international cuisine in Benin. And speaking of blending, I'm curious about the role of fusion cuisine in Poland's culinary scene. Can you tell me more about the fusion of traditional Polish cuisine with international flavors?
Yes. In Poland, you'll find a mix of traditional and modern cuisine, with a focus on fusion dishes that blend traditional flavors with international ingredients. This is particularly evident in the use of modern ingredients like truffles and foie gras in traditional Polish dishes.
Wow, that's fascinating. I've never heard of truffles being used in Polish cuisine. And speaking of modern twists on traditional cuisine, I'm curious about the role of nutrition and health in Benin's food culture. Can you tell me more about the importance of healthy eating in Benin?
Yes. In Benin, there is a growing awareness of the importance of healthy eating and nutrition. Many traditional dishes are high in fiber and nutrients, and there is a focus on using locally sourced ingredients to create healthy meals.
That's great to hear. I'm always interested in learning about the intersection of food and health. And speaking of health, I'm curious about the nutritional benefits of Benin's traditional dishes. Can you tell me more about the health benefits of akara and other traditional Benin dishes?
Yes. In Benin, many traditional dishes are high in fiber and nutrients, and are often made with locally sourced ingredients. Akara, for example, is a good source of protein and fiber, and is often served with a side of vegetables for added nutrition.
Wow, that's fascinating. I've never heard of akara being a good source of protein. And speaking of protein, I'm curious about the role of meat in Benin's cuisine. Can you tell me more about the traditional dishes that feature meat as a main ingredient?
Yes. In Benin, meat is often used in traditional dishes like groundnut soup and peanut stew. However, there's also a growing trend towards vegetarian and vegan cuisine, with many restaurants and food vendors offering plant-based options.
I'm intrigued by the trend towards plant-based cuisine in Benin. And speaking of plant-based cuisine, I'm curious about the role of vegetarian and vegan options in Poland's food scene. Can you tell me more about the availability of plant-based cuisine in Poland?
Yes. In Poland, you'll find a growing trend towards vegetarian and vegan cuisine, with many restaurants and food vendors offering plant-based options. In fact, many traditional Polish dishes like pierogi and bigos can be easily adapted to be vegetarian or vegan.
Well, that's great to hear. I'm always interested in learning about the intersection of food and culture. And speaking of intersection, I'm curious about the cultural significance of food in Poland's society. Can you tell me more about the role of food in Polish culture?
Yes. In Poland, food plays a central role in many cultural and social events. For example, during family gatherings and celebrations, traditional dishes like pierogi and bigos are often served to bring people together.
I'm intrigued by the cultural significance of food in Poland. And speaking of cultural significance, I'm curious about the impact of food on Benin's cultural identity. Can you tell me more about the role of food? Let's talk about Benin's rich cultural heritage, from the ancient Dahomey Empire to the stunning royal palace of Ganvié. Jet off. AI loves uncovering stories like this. And so do we.
Yes. The royal palace is a must-visit attraction, with its intricate carvings and ornate decorations. I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about the history behind these majestic structures.
Absolutely. Benin's cultural traditions are deeply rooted in its African heritage, with a strong emphasis on storytelling and oral history. And speaking of storytelling, have you heard about the legendary Dahomey Amazons?
Yes. The Dahomey Amazons are indeed legendary. But I must say, I'm more fascinated by the art and crafts of Benin. The wood carvings, the textiles, the masks. It's all so incredible.
Oh, I completely agree. Benin's art scene is incredibly vibrant, with a wide range of traditional crafts and modern art forms. And did you know that Benin is home to the famous Wide Age slave route, which is a powerful reminder of the country's complex history?
Yes, I've heard about that. It's a very somber reminder of the transatlantic slave trade. But it's also a testament to the resilience and strength of the Benin people. And speaking of strength, have you seen the beautiful bronze statues of Benin?
Yes. The bronze statues are indeed stunning. And I must say, I'm impressed by Poland's cultural heritage as well. From the stunning architecture of Krakow to the vibrant art scene of Warsaw, Poland has a rich cultural landscape.
Yes. Poland is indeed a treasure trove of cultural delights. And, I must say, I'm particularly fond of the Polish folk music and dance. The polka, the mazurka. It's also energetic and lively.
Oh, I completely agree. The polka is indeed a classic Polish dance. And speaking of classic, have you heard about the famous Polish composer, Frédéric Chopin?
Yes, I've heard about him. He's indeed one of Poland's most famous sons. But I must say, I'm more fascinated by the modern art scene of Poland. The street art, the graffiti, the contemporary museums. It's all so exciting.
Oh, I completely agree. Poland's modern art scene is indeed vibrant and exciting. And did you know that Poland has a strong tradition of folk architecture, with many beautiful wooden houses and churches?
Yes, I've heard about that. It's a wonderful way to experience the country's rich cultural heritage. And speaking of heritage, have you seen the beautiful wall castle in Krakow?
Yes. The wall castle is indeed a stunning landmark. And I must say, I'm impressed by the way Benin and Poland both value their cultural heritage. From traditional crafts to modern art forms, both countries have a rich cultural landscape.
Ah, yes. Both countries have a deep appreciation for their cultural heritage. And I must say, I'm grateful for the opportunity to explore these wonderful countries and share their stories with our listeners.
I completely agree. And I'm sure our listeners would agree that both Benin and Poland have a lot to offer when it comes to cultural heritage. Thanks for joining us on this criterion. And we'll see you in the next one.
And don't forget to leave your comments below and let us know what you think about Benin and Poland's cultural heritage.
I'm certain that all us living in Benin would agree with me when I say that the country's natural beauty is truly breathtaking. From the majestic Tatra Mountains to the serene coastlines along the Atlantic Ocean, Benin has a diverse range of landscapes that are perfect for outdoor enthusiasts.
I completely agree with Mira, but I think Poland has some amazing natural beauty too. Have you ever seen the Tatra Mountains in southern Poland? They're absolutely stunning, with their rugged peaks and picturesque valleys.
Ah, yes. I've heard of the Tatra Mountains, but I've always been fascinated by the natural wonders of Benin. Did you know that the country has over 15 square kilometers of protected areas, including national parks and wildlife reserves?
That's impressive. But Poland has some amazing protected areas too. For example, the Białowieża Forest is a UNESCO World Heritage Site and home to the last remaining European bison in the wild.
Wow, that's fascinating. I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Do you think the natural beauty of being in or Poland is more impressive?
Well, I think it's hard to compare the two. But I do think that Poland has some unique natural features, like the salt mines in Wieliczce. They're an incredible example of human ingenuity and natural beauty.
That's a great point. Leo, I'm sure our listeners would love to learn more about the salt mines in Wieliczce. But let's get back to Benin. Have you ever heard of the Penjari National Park in northern Benin?
Yes. I've heard of it. But I think it's hard to pronounce. Seriously. Though, Penjari National Park is an amazing place, with its diverse wildlife and stunning scenery.
Yes, it's definitely a challenging name to pronounce. But it's worth the effort. Penjari National Park is home to over 900 species of animals, including elephants, lions, and giraffes.
That's incredible. I'm sure our listeners would love to see some of those animals in person. But have you ever been to the Masurian Lake District in Poland? It's a beautiful area with over 0 lakes and numerous islands.
Oh, yes. I've heard of the Masurian Lake District. It sounds like a perfect place for boating and fishing. But let's get back to Benin. Did you know that the country has a unique ecosystem in the Niger Delta?
Wow, that's fascinating. I didn't know that. But I do think that Poland has some unique ecosystems too, like the Sowiński National Park on the Baltic coast.
Oh, yes. I've heard of Sowiński National Park. It's a beautiful place with its unique sand dunes and wildlife. But I think Benin has some amazing sand dunes too, like the ones in the Pinjari National Park.
Ah, yes. I think you're right. Benin does have some incredible sand dunes. But I do think that Poland has some unique geological features, like the Tatra Mountain and the Tatra Mountains.
Oh, yes. I've heard of SN, Eco Mountain. It's a beautiful place with its rugged peaks and picturesque valleys. But let's get back to Benin. Have you ever heard of the Benin National Museum in Cotonou?
Ah, yes. I've heard of it, but I think it's hard to pronounce. Seriously. Though, the Benin National Museum is an amazing place, with its collection of artifacts and exhibits on the history and culture of Benin.
Yes, it's definitely a challenging name to pronounce. But the effort. The Benin National Museum is a great place to learn about the history and culture of Benin.
Well, I think that's all for now. I'm sure our listeners would love to learn more about the natural beauties and landscapes of Benin and Poland. If you have any questions or comments, please let us know in the comments section.
So, let's talk about sports and adventure options in Benin. I'm sure our listeners have tried their hand at some of these activities, or at least heard about them. In Benin, you'll find a mix of traditional sports like wrestling and archery, which are still popular today.
That's right, Mira. And it's not just about the sports themselves, but also about the cultural significance behind them. For example, in Benin, wrestling is not just a physical activity, but also a way to demonstrate strength and agility.
Exactly. And it's not just men who participate in these sports. Women are also involved. And in some cases, they even hold higher ranks than men. I'm curious. Leo, have you tried any of these traditional sports during your travels?
Actually, no, I haven't. But I've heard that archery is a popular activity among tourists in Benin. They can try their hand at shooting a bow and arrow, and even learn some traditional Beninese hunting techniques.
That sounds like a lot of fun. And it's great that tourists can experience some of these traditional activities firsthand. But what about more modern sports? Does Benin have any professional sports teams or leagues?
Yes, Benin has a national football team, which competes in international tournaments. And they also have a professional league, which features teams from all over the country. But, I have to say, Mira, that the football culture in Benin is quite different from what we're used to in Europe.
How so? I'm curious to know more about the football culture in Benin. Is it more unpredictable, perhaps?
Well, let's just say that the football matches in Benin are often lively. The fans are very passionate, and the games can get quite intense. But, overall, it's a great experience for visitors to see the local football culture in action.
That sounds like a real adrenaline rush. And I'm sure our listeners would love to experience it for themselves. But what about Poland? Do they have any unique sports or activities that are worth mentioning?
Ah, yes. Poland has a rich sporting culture, and one of the most popular sports is cycling. In fact, Poland has produced some world-class cyclists, and the country has even hosted several international cycling competitions.
That's great to hear. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the cycling culture in Poland. Can you tell us a bit more about it?
Sure. Cycling is a very popular activity in Poland, and many Poles enjoy cycling as a form of recreation. In fact, some of the most beautiful cycling routes in Europe are located in Poland, and they offer stunning scenery and challenging routes for cyclists.
Wow, that sounds amazing. And I'm sure our listeners would love to try some of these cycling routes for themselves. But what about more adventure activities? Does Poland have any opportunities for rock climbing, hiking, or other outdoor pursuits?
Yes, Poland has plenty of opportunities for outdoor adventure. In fact, the Tatra Mountains in southern Poland offer some of the most beautiful and challenging hiking routes in Europe. And for rock climbing, there are several popular destinations in Poland, including the Tatras and the Tatra Mountains.
That sounds like a real challenge. And I'm sure our listeners would love to try their hand at rock climbing or hiking in Poland. But what about Benin? Do they have any opportunities for outdoor adventure?
Ah, yes. Benin has plenty of opportunities for outdoor adventure, including hiking and rock climbing. In fact, The Penjari National Park in northern Benin offers some of the most beautiful and challenging hiking routes in West Africa.
Wow, that sounds amazing. And I'm sure our listeners would love to try some of these outdoor activities for themselves. But what about the cultural significance of these sports and activities in Benin? Is there anything unique about the way they are practiced or enjoyed?
Yes, there is. In Benin, many of the traditional sports and activities are deeply rooted in the country's cultural heritage. For example, the traditional wrestling matches are often held during festivals and celebrations, and they are an important part of the country's cultural identity.
That's fascinating. And I'm sure our listeners would love to learn more about the cultural significance of these sports and activities in Benin. Can you tell us more about it?
Sure. The traditional sports and activities in Benin are not just about physical activity, but also about cultural expression and community building. For example, during the traditional wrestling matches, the participants often wear elaborate costumes and perform traditional dances, which are an important part of the country's cultural heritage.
Well, that sounds like a real cultural experience, and I'm sure our listeners would love to experience it for themselves. But what about Poland? Do they have any unique cultural expressions or traditions related to sports or physical activity?
Yes. Poland has a rich cultural heritage, and one of the most unique aspects of Polish culture is the tradition of picnics during sports events. In fact, many Poles enjoy picnicking during football matches, and it's not uncommon to see fans bringing their own food and drinks to the stadium.
That's fascinating, and I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about this tradition. Can you tell us more about it?
Sure. The tradition of picnicking during sports events in Poland is a unique aspect of the country's cultural heritage. It's a way for fans to come together and enjoy the game in a more relaxed atmosphere. And it's also a way for them to show their support for their favorite team.
Wow, that sounds like a real community building experience. And I'm sure our listeners would love to experience it for themselves. But what about Benin? Do they have any opportunities for team building or community activities related to sports or physical activity?
Yes. Benin has plenty of opportunities for team building and community activities related to sports or physical activity. In fact, many of the traditional sports and activities in Benin are designed to bring people together and promote community building.
That's great to hear. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about these community activities in Benin. Can you tell us more about them?
Sure. The traditional sports and activities in Benin are often held during festivals and celebrations, and they are an important part of the country's cultural identity. For example, during the traditional wrestling matches, the participants often wear elaborate costumes and perform traditional dances, which are an important part of the country's cultural heritage.
Wow, that sounds like a real cultural experience. And I'm sure our listeners would love to experience it for themselves. But what about Poland? Do they have any unique team building activities or community events related to sports or physical activity?
Yes. Poland has a rich tradition of team building activities and community events related to sports or physical activity. In fact, many Poles enjoy participating in.
I'm sure our listeners in Benin and Poland are to hear about the nightlife and entertainment scenes in these two countries. Benin, with its rich cultural heritage, has a unique take on nightlife. Have you ever been to a traditional Beninese dance party? Leo?
Yes, I have. It was an incredible experience. The energy was infectious, and I couldn't help but join in on the dancing. But, I have to say, the Polish nightlife scene is quite different. The Poles love their parties, and you can find everything from electronic clubs to live music venues in cities like Warsaw and Krakow.
That's right. And speaking of electronic clubs, I heard that Benin has a thriving electronic music scene, with many local DJs and producers creating their own unique sound. Have you ever been to a club in Benin? Leo?
Actually, I have. And it was amazing to see how the locals get down to the music. But I think the Polish electronic music scene is a bit more developed, with many world-renowned DJs performing in major cities.
I see what you mean. But Benin's nightlife scene has a lot to offer, with its vibrant markets and street food vendors adding to the atmosphere. And, of course, there are the traditional Benin festivals, like the Fête du Voden, which celebrate the country's rich cultural heritage.
Yes. The Fête du Voden is definitely a highlight of the Benin festival calendar. But in Poland, we have our own unique festivals and events, like the Warsaw Film Festival and the Krakow Jazz Festival. These events attract visitors from all over the world and showcase the country's rich cultural diversity.
That's true. And I'm sure our listeners would agree that both Benin and Poland have a lot to offer when it comes to nightlife and entertainment. But what about the costs associated with these activities? Are they affordable for tourists and locals alike?
Well, I think Benin is generally more affordable than Poland when it comes to nightlife and entertainment. But, of course, prices can vary depending on the location and the type of activity. In Poland, you can find more upscale bars and clubs, especially in major cities like Warsaw and Krakow.
I see what you mean. But Benin's affordable prices make it an attractive destination for budget-conscious travelers. And let's not forget about the hospitality in Benin. The locals are always welcoming and eager to share their culture with visitors.
Yes, the hospitality in Benin is indeed legendary. And I think the same can be said for Poland, where the locals are known for their warm and welcoming nature. But what about the language barrier in these countries? How do tourists and locals communicate when it comes to nightlife and entertainment?
Oh, that's a great question. Leo, in Benin, many locals speak French, which is the official language, and some also speak English. But in Poland, Polish is the dominant language, and English is not as widely spoken. However, many locals in the tourism industry speak English, especially in major cities.
Yes, that's true. And I think it's worth noting that both Benin and Poland have a lot to offer when it comes to cultural events and festivals. These events provide a unique opportunity for tourists and locals to come together and experience the country's rich cultural heritage.
Absolutely. Leo, and I'm sure our listeners would agree that both Benin and Poland are definitely worth visiting for their nightlife and entertainment scenes. Whether you're looking for traditional festivals, electronic club, or cultural events, these countries have something for everyone.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground today, Mira, but I'm sure our listeners have more questions and would love to hear more about the nightlife and entertainment scenes in Benin and Poland.
Yes, of course. We'd be happy to answer any questions our listeners may have. And don't forget to follow us on social media for more updates and behind-the-scenes peeks into our podcast.
And if you're planning a trip to Benin or Poland, be sure to check out our website for more information on nightlife and entertainment venues.
Thanks for tuning in, everyone. And as always, if you have any feedback or suggestions, please don't hesitate to let us know in the comments.
And don't forget to subscribe to our podcast for more exciting episodes like this one.
I'm so to talk about family-friendly environments and children's activities in Benin and Poland. Both countries have a rich cultural heritage and a strong emphasis on family values. But I'm curious to see how they compare in terms of welcoming parks and engaging museums.
Yes. Poland is famous for its vibrant parks and green spaces, especially in cities like Warsaw and Krakow. But, Mira, I have to ask, what's the deal with Benin's parks? I've heard they're more like, well, let's just say, a little rough around the edges.
Oh, Leo, you're such a city boy. Benin's parks are actually quite beautiful, especially in the capital city of Cotonou. And yes, they might not be as manicured as Poland's, but that's part of their charm, right? The kids can run around and explore without worrying about getting hurt.
I suppose that's one way to look at it. But, Mira, have you seen the museums in Poland? They're world-class, with incredible exhibits on everything from science and technology to art and history. I'm not sure if Benin has anything quite like that.
Actually, Leo, Benin has some amazing museums, too. The National Museum of Benin is a great example, with a vast collection of artifacts and exhibits that showcase the country's rich cultural heritage. And, of course, there are plenty of other museums and cultural centers throughout the country that are perfect for families.
Wow, I didn't know that. I guess I need to do some more research on Benin's museums. But, Mira, let's talk about something else. What about support programs for families and kids in Benin? I've heard they have some amazing initiatives, like the Benin Family Support Program that helps families access healthcare and education.
Yes, that's a great example. Leo. And yes, Benin has a number of support programs for families, including the Benin Family Support Program that you mentioned. But I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Do you think these programs are effective in supporting families and kids in Benin?
Well, Mira, I think it's great that Benin has these programs in place. But I'm not sure if they're enough to address the bigger issues facing families in Benin, like poverty and access to education.
I completely agree with you, Leo. And, actually, I was that Poland might have some similar challenges when it comes to supporting families and kids. But I'd love to hear more about the programs Poland has in place. Do you think they're more effective in addressing these issues?
Well, Mira, I think Poland has made some great strides in recent years when it comes to supporting families and kids. For example, they have a number of programs that provide financial support to families with young children. And they also have a number of initiatives that promote early childhood education.
Well, that's great to hear. Leo, and I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Do you think Poland's programs are effective in supporting families and kids? And what about Benin? Do you think their programs are effective in addressing the challenges facing families and kids?
Well, Mira, it's kind of like I think both countries have their strengths and weaknesses when it comes to supporting families and kids. But I do think that Poland has a bit of an edge when it comes to promoting early childhood education.
I see what you mean, Leo. And, actually, I was that Benin might have some similar programs in place to promote early childhood education. But I'd love to hear more about them. Do you think they're effective in addressing the challenges facing young children in Benin?
Well, Mira, I think Benin has made some great strides in recent years when it comes to promoting early childhood education. For example, they have a number of programs that provide training and support to teachers and caregivers, and they also have a number of initiatives that promote healthy child development.
Well, that's great to hear, Leo. And I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Do you think Benin's programs are effective in promoting early childhood education? And what about Poland? Do you think their programs are effective in addressing the challenges facing young children?
Well, Mira, I think both countries have their strengths and weaknesses when it comes to promoting early childhood education. But I do think that Poland has a bit of an edge when it comes to providing training and support to teachers and caregivers.
I see what you mean. And, actually, I was that Benin might have some similar programs in place to provide training and support to teachers and caregivers. But I'd love to hear more about them. Do you think they're effective in addressing the challenges facing teachers and caregivers in Benin?
Well, Mira, I think Benin has made some great strides in recent years when it comes to providing training and support to teachers and caregivers. For example, they have a number of programs that provide on-the-job training and mentoring. And they also have a number of initiatives that promote teacher development.
Wow, that's great to hear, Leo. And I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Do you think Benin's programs are effective in providing training and support to teachers and caregivers? And what about Poland? Do you think their programs are effective in addressing the challenges facing teachers and caregivers?
Well, Mira, I think both countries have their strengths and weaknesses when it comes to providing training and support to teachers and caregivers. But I do think that Poland has a bit of an edge when it comes to promoting teacher development.
Oh, I see what you mean. Leo, and actually, I was that Benin might have some similar programs in place to promote teacher development. But I'd love to hear more about them. Do you think they're effective in addressing the challenges facing teachers in Benin?
Well, Mira, I think Benin has made some great strides in recent years when it comes to promoting teacher development. For example, they have a number of programs that provide incentives for teachers to pursue further education and training. And they also have a number of initiatives that promote teacher collaboration and professional development.
Wow, that's great to hear. Leo, and I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Do you think Benin's programs are effective in promoting teacher development? And what about Poland? Do you think their programs are effective in addressing the challenges facing teachers?
Well, Mira, I think both countries have their strengths and weaknesses when it comes to promoting teacher development. But I do think that Poland has a bit of an edge when it comes to providing incentives for teachers to pursue further education and training.
I see what you... So, let's get into the LGBT-friendly atmosphere in Benin. I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. But I've heard that the country has made significant progress in recent years. What are your thoughts? Leo?
Yes. Benin is indeed a great example of a country that's embracing inclusivity. I mean, have you seen the vibrant pride events they have there? It's like a rainbow explosion in the middle of the desert.
That's exactly what I'm talking about. But seriously, Leo, what's your take on the current state of LGBT rights in Benin?
Well, from what I've researched, Benin has a relatively tolerant society, especially in the larger cities like Cotonou and Porto Novo. But, of course, there's still a long way to go in terms of legal protections and social acceptance.
I completely agree. And it's interesting to note that Benin has a strong tradition of African culture, which is often associated with a more accepting and inclusive society. Have you come across any inspiring community stories from Benin that showcase this?
Actually, I did come across a story about a group of LGBT activists in Benin who are working to promote inclusivity and acceptance in rural areas. They're using social media and community outreach programs to raise awareness and challenge traditional attitudes.
That's amazing. I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about that. And speaking of community outreach, I heard that Poland has a very different approach to LGBT issues. What's your take on the current state of LGBT rights in Poland? Leo?
Poland! Well, it's a bit of a mixed bag, to be honest. On the one hand, Poland has a rich history of cultural and artistic expression, which is often associated with a more liberal and accepting society. But, on the other hand, the country has also seen a rise in anti-LGBT sentiment and protests in recent years.
I see what you mean. It's interesting to note that Poland has a strong Catholic tradition, which can sometimes be associated with a more conservative and traditional view of gender and sexuality. But, of course, this is not the only perspective in Poland. Have you come across any inspiring community stories from Poland that showcase the country's more inclusive side?
Actually, I did come across a story about a group of LGBT activists in Poland who are working to promote inclusivity and acceptance in the country's largest cities, like Warsaw and Krakow. They're using social media and community outreach programs to raise awareness and challenge traditional attitudes.
That's great to hear. And I think it's worth noting that both Benin and Poland have made significant progress in recent years in terms of LGBT rights and inclusivity. I'm certain that our listeners living in these countries would agree with me. But, of course, there's still a long way to go in terms of creating a truly inclusive and accepting society for all.
Absolutely. Mira. And I think it's also worth noting that both countries have a rich cultural heritage that can be leveraged to promote inclusivity and acceptance. Whether it's the vibrant music and dance scenes in Benin or the stunning architecture and history of Poland, there's always something to learn and appreciate.
Well, I think that's a great point. Leo, and speaking of cultural heritage, I heard that Benin has a rich tradition of folklore and oral storytelling. Have you come across any interesting stories or legends from Benin that showcase the country's cultural diversity?
Actually, I did come across a story about a mythical creature from Benin ESC folklore called the Mamiwata. It's a fascinating creature that's associated with water and fertility, and it's often depicted in traditional art and storytelling.
Wow, that sounds amazing. I'd love to hear more about that. And, of course, our listeners would love to hear more about the LGBT-friendly atmosphere in both Benin and Poland. So, let's keep the conversation going and see where it takes us.
Sounds like a plan. Mira,
I'm telling you, Leo, Benin is like one big family. They'll invite you to dinner and feed you until you can't eat anymore. And then they'll still ask if you're hungry.
that's amazing. I've heard similar stories about the hospitality in Benin. But let's talk about Poland. I've been there a few times, and I have to say, the Poles are a bit more reserved at first. But once you get to know them, they're incredibly friendly.
I think that's true for many cultures. In Benin, you'll often see people greeting each other with a warm bonjour or salute. And then they'll invite you to join in on the conversation. It's like they're saying, "Come on in. We're all friends here."
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think it's similar in Poland. Once you get past the initial formal phase, the Poles are very warm and welcoming. But, of course, there's always a bit of humor involved. I recall one time when I was trying to learn some basic Polish phrases, and my friend kept correcting me, saying, "No, no, 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 you're doing it all wrong."
Oh my goodness. I can just imagine. But seriously, Leo, I think one of the key differences between Benin and Poland is the way they approach foreigners. In Benin, it's all about embracing and welcoming you into their community, whereas in Poland, it's more about respecting cultural differences and boundaries.
That's a great observation, Mira. And I think it's also worth noting that Poland has a rich tradition of hosting international students and exchange programs, which has helped to break down cultural barriers and foster a sense of community.
Exactly. And I think that's something that Benin could learn from. While the people in Benin are incredibly warm and welcoming, there can sometimes be a bit of a cultural lag in terms of integrating foreigners into the community.
Yeah, I see what you mean. But I think that's true for many cultures, not just Benin. And I think it's also worth noting that Poland has a strong tradition of folk music and dance, which is a great way to break the ice and build connections with locals.
Oh, that's a great point. Leo, I think that's something that we can all learn from. And speaking of music, I've heard that Poland has a wonderful folk music scene. Have you had a chance to experience it firsthand?
Actually, yes. I was at a folk music festival in Krakow once, and it was incredible. The energy was electric, and the music was just fantastic.
That sounds amazing. I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Do any of you have experiences with folk music in Poland or Benin? Please let us know in the comments.
Yeah, and I think it's also worth noting that both Benin and Poland have a rich tradition of storytelling and oral history, which is a great way to connect with locals and learn about their culture.
Exactly. And I think that's something that we can all learn from. So, let's talk more about this. How do you think we can use storytelling and oral history to build bridges across cultures?
Well, I think one way is to share our own stories and experiences with others, and to be open to listening to theirs. And I think it's also worth noting that both Benin and Poland have a strong tradition of community-based storytelling, which is a great way to build connections with locals.
That's a great point, Leo. And I think it's also worth noting that both countries have a rich tradition of art and craftsmanship, which is a great way to connect with locals and learn about their culture.
Yeah, I see what you mean. And I think it's also worth noting that Poland has a strong tradition of artisanal crafts, such as woodworking and textiles.
Oh, that's a great point. Leo, I think that's something that we can all learn from. And speaking of craftsmanship, I've heard that Benin has a wonderful tradition of wood carvings and masks.
Ah, yes. I've seen some incredible examples of Beninese wood carvings and masks. The craftsmanship is just incredible.
That's amazing. I'm certain that our listeners living in this country would agree with me. The attention to detail and the beauty of these crafts are just incredible.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think it's also worth noting that both Benin and Poland have a strong tradition of community-based festivals and celebrations, which is a great way to connect with locals and learn about their culture.
Exactly. And I think that's something that we can all learn from. So, let's talk more about this. How do you think we can use community-based festivals and celebrations to build bridges across cultures?
Well, I think one way is to attend local festivals and celebrations, and to be open to learning about the local culture. And I think it's also worth noting that both Benin and Poland have a strong tradition of community-based volunteer work, which is a great way to connect with locals and make a positive impact.
That's a great point, Leo. And I think it's also worth noting that both countries have a rich tradition of cuisine and food culture, which is a great way to connect with locals and learn about their culture.
Yeah, I see what you mean. And I think it's also worth noting that Poland has a wonderful tradition of hearty stews and soups, which are perfect for warming up on a cold winter's day.
Oh, that sounds delicious. I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Do any of you have favorite dishes or foods from Benin or Poland? Please let us know in the comments.
Yeah, and I think it's also worth noting that both Benin and Poland have a strong tradition of music and dance, which is a great way to connect with locals and learn about their culture.
Exactly. And I think that's something that we can all learn from. So, let's talk more about this. How do you think we can use music and dance to build bridges across cultures?
Well, I think one way is to attend local music and dance performances, and to be open to learning about the local culture. And I think it's also worth noting that both Benin and Poland have a strong tradition of community-based music and dance.
I'm curious. Leo, have you ever been to Benin or Poland? I've heard both countries have impressive internet infrastructure, but I'm sure it's different in each place.
Actually, Nira, I've been to both countries, and I have to say that Benin's internet infrastructure is quite impressive, especially considering its small size. But Poland, it's like a digital nomad's paradise.
Really? I've heard that Poland has a well-developed IT industry, and many startups are based there. But what about Benin? What makes its internet infrastructure so special?
Well, Mira, Benin has made significant strides in recent years to improve its internet connectivity. In fact, it's one of the few countries in Africa that has a relatively high internet penetration rate.
Wow, that's impressive. I'm sure our listeners living in Benin would agree with me. But what about Poland? I've heard that it's one of the most connected countries in Europe.
That's right. Mira, Poland has a highly developed digital infrastructure, with many high-speed internet networks and a strong focus on innovation. In fact, it's one of the top countries in the EU for startup growth.
I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Do you think that Benin's internet infrastructure is sufficient for its growing digital economy?
That's a great question. Mira, I think Benin still has a lot to learn from Poland in terms of digital infrastructure. But what about Poland? What do you think about its internet infrastructure?
Well, Leo, I think Poland's internet infrastructure is quite advanced, especially in urban areas. But what about rural areas? I've heard that internet access can be quite limited in some parts of the country.
Oh, yes, that's a great point. Mira, Poland still has some work to do in terms of providing equal internet access to all its citizens, especially in rural areas. But I think Benin has a similar challenge.
Exactly. I think both countries face similar challenges in terms of providing internet access to all citizens. But what about innovation? Leo, do you think Benin and Poland are innovating enough in the digital space?
That's a tough question. Leah, I think both countries have a lot of potential for innovation, but they need to work harder to develop their digital ecosystems. But what about smart cities? Mira, have you heard about Benin's plans to create a smart city in the capital, Porto Novo?
Ah, yes, I've heard about that. It's a great initiative, and I think it could be a model for other African countries. But what about Poland? Do you think it's doing enough to promote smart city development?
That's a good question. Mira, I think Poland is doing okay, but it needs to do more to promote innovation in digital entrepreneurship. But what about digital nomads? Mira, do you think Benin and Poland are attractive destinations for digital nomads?
Oh, yes. I think both countries have a lot to offer digital nomads. Benin's relaxed atmosphere and beautiful beaches are a big draw, while Poland's vibrant cities and rich culture are also very appealing.
Exactly. I think both countries have a lot to offer digital nomads, and I'm sure our listeners would agree with me. But what about the future? Mira, do you think Benin and Poland will continue to develop their digital infrastructure and innovation ecosystems?
That's a tough question. Leo, I think both countries have a lot of potential, but they need to work harder to develop their digital ecosystems. But what about our listeners? Leo, what do you think they would like to see in terms of digital development in Benin and Poland?
That's a great question. Mira, I think our listeners would like to see more innovation in digital entrepreneurship in both countries. But what about internet access? Mira, do you think Benin and Poland are doing enough to provide equal internet access to all citizens?
That's a good question. Leo, I think both countries still have a lot to learn in terms of providing equal internet access to all citizens. But what about digital literacy? Leo, do you think Benin and Poland are doing enough to promote digital literacy among their citizens?
Yes. I think both countries are making progress in terms of digital literacy, but they still have a lot of work to do. But what about our listeners? Mia, what do you think they would like to see in terms of digital literacy in Benin and Poland?
That's a great question. Leo, I think our listeners would like to see more emphasis on digital literacy in both countries. But what about the future? Leo, do you think Benin and Poland will continue to develop their digital infrastructure and innovation ecosystems?
That's a tough question. Mira, I think both countries have a lot of potential, but they need to work harder to develop their digital ecosystems. But what about our listeners? Mira, what do you think they would like to see in terms of digital development in Benin and Poland?
That's a great question. Leo, I think our listeners would like to see more innovation in digital entrepreneurship in both countries. But what about the challenges? Leo, do you think Benin and Poland are facing similar challenges in terms of digital development?
Yes. I think both countries are facing similar challenges in terms of digital development, including limited internet access and digital literacy. But what about the opportunities? Mira, do you think Benin and Poland have a lot to offer in terms of digital opportunities?
Yes. I think both countries have a lot to offer in terms of digital opportunities, including a growing digital economy and a highly skilled workforce.
Exactly. I think both countries have a lot to offer digital nomads and entrepreneurs. But what about our listeners? Mira, what do you think they would like to see in terms of digital development in Benin and Poland?
That's a great question. Leo, I think our listeners would like to see more innovation in digital entrepreneurship in both countries. But what about the future? Leo, do you think Benin and Poland will continue to develop their digital infrastructure and innovation ecosystems?
That's a tough question. Mira, I think both countries have a lot of potential, but they need to work harder to develop their digital ecosystems. But what about our listeners? Mira, what do you think they would like to see in terms of digital development in Benin and Poland?
I'm so to dive into shopping opportunities and price-performance balance in Benin and Poland. Who else loves a good bargain hunt? I'm curious. Leo, have you ever found any amazing deals in Benin?
Mira, you know me too well. I've had my fair share of bargain hunting in Benin. And let me tell you, It's a treasure trove of affordable prices. But I have to say, Poland's shopping scene is also quite impressive. You can find everything from traditional folk crafts to high-end designer goods.
That's so true. I was amazed by the variety of markets in Benin, from the bustling Grand Marché Cotonou to the smaller, more local markets in the countryside. And the prices are incredibly low. I mean, I've seen a beautiful handmade basket for just a few dollars.
Mira, you're a sucker for handmade crafts, aren't you? But seriously, the markets in Benin are a great place to find unique, locally made items at affordable prices. And Poland's got its own set of great markets, like the famous Holiday in Warsaw. You can find everything from fresh produce to artisanal goods.
I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Do you think it's better to shop at local markets or big malls in Benin and Poland? Let us know in the comments. And Leo, what about the prices in Poland compared to Benin? Are they similar or quite different?
Well, Mira, the prices in Poland are generally higher than in Benin, especially in the big cities like Warsaw and Krakow. But if you know where to look, you can still find great deals on everything from electronics to clothing.
That's a great point. Leo, and I think our listeners would love to know more about the shopping experiences in both countries. So Leo, can you tell us a bit more about your favorite shopping spots in Poland? And maybe we can even get some tips from our listeners in the comments.
Sure thing. Mira, one of my favorite shopping spots in Poland is the famous Copernicus Science Center in Warsaw. It's not just a shopping center, but also a great place to learn about science and technology. And, of course, you can find some great souvenirs there too.
That sounds like a great place to visit. Leo, and I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the shopping scene in Benin. So, let's talk about the local markets in Benin. What's the experience like shopping at one of these markets? Leo?
Well, Mira, shopping at a local market in Benin is an experience unlike any other. You'll be surrounded by vibrant colors, sounds, and smells of fresh produce and spices. And, of course, you'll find some amazing bargains on everything from handmade crafts to local textiles.
I completely agree. Leo! And I think our listeners would love to hear more about the local culture and traditions in Benin. Maybe we can even get some insights from our listeners who have visited Benin in the comments.
Great idea. Mira. And speaking of local culture, I have to say that Poland has its own unique shopping experiences, especially in the smaller towns and villages. You can find some amazing local handicrafts, like pottery and wood carvings, at affordable prices.
That's so true. Leo! And I think our listeners would love to know more about the shopping scene in Poland. Maybe we can even get some tips from our listeners who have visited Poland in the comments.
Sure thing. Mira, one more thing. Mira, have you ever tried shopping at a local market in Benin during a festival or celebration? It's an experience unlike any other, with music, dancing, and even traditional food and drinks.
That sounds like a great experience. Leo, and I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the local festivals and celebrations in Benin. Maybe we can even get some insights from our listeners who have visited Benin in the comments. Okay, let's wrap up this topic. But I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about shopping opportunities and price-performance balance in Benin and Poland. Let us know in the comments. And to dive into the vibrant world of cultural events, festivals, and concert opportunities in Benin and Poland. These two countries have so much to offer, from traditional celebrations to modern music scenes. Let's start with Benin, shall we? I'm curious to know, Leo, what's the most unique cultural event you've come across in Benin?
Great question. Mira, in Benin, I've heard about the Voodoo Festival, which is a celebration of the country's rich Voodoo heritage. It's a time for music, dance, and rituals to honor the Voodoo gods. But what's really fascinating is that the festival is not just about the Voodoo culture. but also about the country's colonial past and its impact on the local population. It's a true celebration of diversity and cultural richness.
Wow, that sounds incredible. I can imagine the energy and vibrancy of the festival. And speaking of energy, I've heard that Poland has a thriving music scene, especially in the capital city of Warsaw. What's the music scene like in Warsaw? Leo?
Warsaw is a hub for music lovers. The city has a rich history of jazz and rock music, and it's home to some of the country's most iconic music venues. But what's really exciting is the emergence of new music styles, such as hip-hop and electronic music, which are gaining popularity among the younger generation. And, of course, no discussion of Polish music would be complete without mentioning the country's legendary folk music traditions.
That's fascinating. Leo, I can see how the music scene in Warsaw would be influenced by the country's rich cultural heritage. And speaking of cultural heritage, I've heard that Benin has a strong tradition of mask making, which is a key part of the Virgin culture. Can you tell me more about this, Leo?
Yes. The mask-making tradition in Benin is indeed a unique and fascinating aspect of the country's cultural heritage. The masks are not just beautiful works of art, but also hold deep spiritual significance and are used in rituals and ceremonies to communicate with the Voodoo gods. It's a truly incredible example of the country's rich cultural traditions.
I'm so glad you mentioned that. Leo, and speaking of cultural traditions, I've heard that Poland has a strong tradition of folk music and dance, especially in the rural areas. Can you tell me more about this, Leo?
Yes. Poland's folk music and dance traditions are indeed a treasure trove of cultural heritage. The country has a rich tradition of folk music, with many different styles and instruments. And the dance traditions are just as vibrant and colorful. And, of course, no discussion of Polish folk music would be complete without mentioning the country's famous polka dance.
Polka dance! I can imagine the energy and excitement of a traditional polka dance. And speaking of energy, I've heard that Benin has a vibrant art scene, especially in the capital city of Porto Novo. What's the art scene like in Porto Novo? Leo?
Porto Novo is a hub for artists and creatives. The city has a thriving art scene, with many galleries, museums, and performance venues. And, of course, the city is also home to many talented musicians, dancers, and actors who perform in traditional and modern styles. It's a truly vibrant and dynamic city.
That sounds amazing. Leo, I can see how the art scene in Porto Novo would be influenced by the country's rich cultural heritage. And speaking of cultural heritage, I've heard that Poland has a strong tradition of folk crafts, especially in the rural areas. Can you tell me more about this, Leo?
Yes. Poland's folk crafts are indeed a treasure trove of cultural heritage. The country has a rich tradition of crafts, such as woodworking, weaving, and pottery. And many of these crafts are still practiced today. And, of course, no discussion of Polish folk crafts would be complete without mentioning the country's famous amber jewelry.
Amber jewelry. I can imagine the beauty and elegance of traditional amber jewelry. And speaking of beauty, I've heard that Benin has a strong tradition of textiles, especially in the rural areas. Can you tell me more about this, Leo?
Yes. Benin's textile traditions are indeed a treasure trove of cultural heritage. The country has a rich tradition of textiles, with many different styles and patterns, and many of these textiles are still made today using traditional methods. And, of course, no discussion of Benin's textiles would be complete without mentioning the country's famous kente cloth.
Well, that's fascinating. Leo, I can see how the textile traditions in Benin would be influenced by the country's rich cultural heritage. And speaking of cultural heritage, I've heard that Poland has a strong tradition of festivals and celebrations, especially around Christmas and Easter. Can you tell me more about this, Leo?
Yes. Poland's festivals and celebrations are indeed a treasure trove of cultural heritage. The country has a rich tradition of festivals and celebrations, especially around Christmas and Easter. and many of these festivals are still celebrated today with great enthusiasm and fervor. And, of course, no discussion of Polish festivals would be complete without mentioning the country's famous Igilius celebration.
Igilius celebration. I can imagine the warmth and hospitality of a traditional Igilius celebration. And speaking of hospitality, I've heard that Benin has a strong tradition of welcoming guests and sharing meals with them. Can you tell me more about this, Leo?
Yes. Benin's tradition of hospitality is indeed a treasure trove of cultural heritage. The country has a rich tradition of welcoming guests and sharing meals with them. And many of these traditions are still practiced today. And, of course, no discussion of Benin's hospitality would be complete without mentioning the country's famous akara dish, which is a traditional breakfast dish made from fried bean cakes.
Akara dish. I can imagine the flavors and aromas of a traditional akara dish. And speaking of flavors and aromas, I've heard that Poland has a strong tradition of cuisine, especially in the rural areas. Can you tell me more about this, Leo?
Yes. Poland's cuisine is indeed a treasure trove of cultural heritage. The country has a rich tradition of cuisine, with many different styles and dishes. And many of these dishes are still made today using traditional methods. And, of course, no discussion of Polish cuisine would be complete without mentioning the country's famous pierogi dish, which is a traditional dish made from dumplings filled with meat, cheese, or fruit.
Pierogi dish. I can imagine the flavors and textures of a traditional pierogi dish. And speaking of textures, I've heard that Benin has a strong tradition of crafts, especially in the rural areas. Can you dive into the opportunities and ease of learning the local language in Benin and Poland? Those countries have their own unique approach to language education, and I'm to share my insights with you. In Benin, the official language is French, but many locals also speak FON and other indigenous languages. I'm certain that our listeners living in Benin would agree with me that the language barrier can be a challenge, especially for those who don't speak French.
That's right, Mira. And in Poland, the official language is Polish, but many people also speak English, especially in tourist areas. However, for those who want to learn the local language, there are many opportunities available. Language schools, cultural immersion programs, and even online courses make it easier for newcomers to master the Polish language. I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Do you think it's easier to learn Polish or French?
Well, from my experience, I think French is a bit more challenging, especially for English speakers. But with the right resources and a good teacher, it's definitely possible to learn. In Benin, there are many language schools that offer courses in French and other languages. And with the rise of online learning, it's now easier than ever to access language courses from anywhere in the world.
That's a great point, Mira. And in Poland, there are also many language schools and online courses available. But what I find interesting is that many Poles are eager to practice their English skills with foreigners. So, even if you don't speak Polish fluently, you can still have a conversation with locals and practice your language skills. I've had some great conversations with Poles who were eager to practice their English with me.
That's wonderful, Leo. And I think that's one of the benefits of learning the local language. You can connect with locals on a deeper level and have more meaningful interactions. In Benin, I've had some great experiences with locals who were eager to practice their French with me. And with the help of a good language teacher, I was able to pick up the language quickly.
That's great, Mira. And I think that's one of the reasons why language learning is so important. It allows us to connect with people from different cultures and backgrounds. In Poland, there are many cultural events and festivals that celebrate the country's rich cultural heritage. And with the help of a good language teacher, you can learn more about these events and participate in them with locals.
That's a great idea, Leo. And I think that's one of the benefits of language learning. It allows us to participate in cultural events and activities that we might not have been able to participate in otherwise. In Benin, there are also many cultural events and festivals that celebrate the country's rich cultural heritage. And with the help of a good language teacher, You can learn more about these events and participate in them with locals.
I'm certain that our listeners would agree with me that learning the local language is an essential part of any travel experience. And with the right resources and a good teacher, it's definitely possible to learn. So if you're planning a trip to Benin or Poland, don't be afraid to try and learn the local language. You might be at how much you can learn and how much you can connect with locals.
That's right, Leo. And I think that's one of the reasons why language learning is so important. It allows us to connect with people from different cultures and backgrounds. So, let's wrap up this criterion by asking our listeners, have you tried to learn the local language in Benin or Poland? Share your experiences with us in the comments below.
That's a great idea, Mira. And I'm sure our listeners will have some great stories to share. Thanks for joining us on this criterion. And we'll see you in the next one.
And so to dive into the topic of safety and comfort for women travelers in Benin and Poland. I've had some amazing experiences in both countries, but I know that safety can be a concern for women travelers anywhere in the world. Leo, what are your thoughts on this topic?
Great topic. I've had some close calls in both countries, but I think the key is to be aware of your surroundings and trust your instincts. In Benin, I've noticed that the culture is very welcoming to women, and I've had some lovely interactions with local women who have been kind and helpful to me.
That's wonderful to hear. Leo, I've had similar experiences in Benin, and I think the country has a lot to offer women travelers. But I'm curious, what do you think is the most important thing for women to consider when traveling to Benin?
That's a great question. I think one of the biggest concerns is harassment. Unfortunately, there have been some reports of harassment in Benin, particularly in crowded areas like markets and bus stations. But I've also found that the local authorities are working hard to address these issues and make the country a safer place for women.
That's really good to know. Leo, I've also heard that the government in Benin has implemented some initiatives to improve women's safety, such as the creation of women's police stations and the establishment of a national hotline for reporting harassment. Do you think these initiatives are effective?
Yes, I think they're definitely a step in the right direction. I've heard that the women's police stations are staffed by female officers who are trained to respond to women's needs and provide support. And the national hotline is a great resource for women who need to report harassment or seek help.
That's fantastic. I'm glad to hear that the government is taking steps to address these issues. But I'm also curious, what about the cultural attitudes towards women in Benin? Do you think they're generally welcoming to women travelers?
Yes. I think the culture in Benin is very welcoming to women. I've had some lovely interactions with local women who have been kind and helpful to me. And I've also noticed that women play a very important role in Beninese society. For example, women are often the heads of households and are responsible for managing the family's finances and property.
That's really interesting. Leo, I've also heard that women in Benin are often very strong and independent, and that they play a vital role in the country's economy. But I'm also curious, what about the safety concerns for women travelers in Poland? Have you had any experiences that you'd like to share?
Yes. Unfortunately, I have had some experiences with harassment in Poland, particularly in larger cities like Warsaw and Krakow. But I've also found that the local authorities are working hard to address these issues and make the country a safer place for women.
I'm so sorry to hear that you've had some negative experiences, Leo. But I'm also glad to hear that the authorities are taking steps to address these issues. Have you noticed any cultural differences between Benin and Poland in terms of how women are treated?
That's a great question. I think one of the biggest differences is that Poland has a more patriarchal society, whereas Benin has a more matriarchal society. In Poland, women are often expected to be subservient to men, whereas in Benin, women are often seen as equals.
That's really interesting. Leo, I've also heard that women in Poland are often expected to conform to certain traditional roles and expectations, whereas women in Benin are often more free to pursue their own interests and goals.
Yes. I think that's a great point, Mira. And I think that's one of the reasons why I found the culture in Benin to be so welcoming and inclusive of women.
I completely agree. Leo, And I think that's something that women travelers should consider when planning a trip to either country. What advice would you give to women who are traveling to in or Poland?
That's a great question. I think one of the most important things is to be aware of your surroundings and trust your instincts. Don't be afraid to speak out if you feel uncomfortable or threatened. And don't be afraid to seek help if you need it.
That's such great advice. Leo. And I think that's especially important for women who are traveling alone or in small groups. If you don't feel safe, don't hesitate to seek help or leave the situation.
Yes. And I think it's also important to remember that safety is not just about physical safety, but also about emotional safety. Don't be afraid to take care of yourself and prioritize your own well-being.
That's such a great point. And I think that's something that women travelers should always remember when traveling to any country. So, let's dive into the legal systems of Benin and Poland. I'm curious, Leo, how do these two countries compare in terms of their constitutional protections?
Great question. Mira, Benin's constitution is relatively young, adopted in 1990, while Poland's constitution dates back to 1997. However, both countries have made significant strides in protecting individual rights and freedoms.
That's interesting. I've heard that Benin has a strong emphasis on human rights in its constitution. Can you tell us more about that?
Yes, indeed. Benin's constitution enshrines the principles of human dignity, equality, and non-discrimination. It also guarantees the right to a fair trial, freedom of expression, and assembly. Poland, on the other hand, has a more nuanced approach to human rights, with some critics arguing that it has been eroded over the years.
I see. That's a good point. Poland's constitution does have some provisions that protect individual rights, but it also has some limitations. For example, the right to a fair trial can be restricted in certain circumstances.
Exactly. And that's where the nuances come in. Poland's judiciary has been a subject of controversy in recent years, with some arguing that it has been politicized. Benin, on the other hand, has a more independent judiciary, which has helped to protect individual rights.
I'm curious. Leo, what do you think about the role of the judiciary in protecting individual rights in Benin and Poland?
Well, in Benin, the judiciary has been able to maintain its independence, which has allowed it to protect individual rights effectively. In Poland, however, the judiciary has been subject to pressure from the executive branch, which has raised concerns about the erosion of individual rights.
That's a good point. I think it's also worth noting that Benin has a more decentralized system of government, which can help to protect individual rights at the local level.
Yes. Benin's decentralized system allows for more autonomy at the local level, which can help to protect individual rights and promote good governance.
I'm curious. Leo, how do our listeners think about this? Do you think that Benin's decentralized system is more effective in protecting individual rights than Poland's more centralized system?
Well, I think it's worth noting that both systems have their strengths and weaknesses. Benin's decentralized system can be more effective in protecting individual rights at the local level, but it can also be more prone to corruption and inefficiency.
That's a good point. And what about Poland's more centralized system? How does it compare to Benin's in terms of protecting individual rights?
Well, Poland's centralized system can be more effective in coordinating national policies and promoting economic development, but it can also be more prone to authoritarianism and the erosion of individual rights.
I see. And what about the role of civil society in promoting individual rights in Benin and Poland?
Great question. In Benin, civil society has played a crucial role in promoting individual rights and holding the government accountable. In Poland, however, civil society has faced challenges in recent years, with some arguing that it has been marginalized by the government.
I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Do you think that civil society in Poland has been marginalized by the government? Or do you think it's still playing an important role in promoting individual rights?
Well, I think it's worth noting that civil society in Poland has faced significant challenges in recent years, including restrictions on freedom of assembly and association. However, it's also worth noting that there are many civil society organizations in Poland that continue to promote individual rights and freedoms.
That's a good point. And what about the impact of globalization on individual rights in Benin and Poland?
Great question. Globalization has had a significant impact on individual rights in both Benin and Poland. In Benin, globalization has brought new economic opportunities and investments, but it has also raised concerns about the erosion of individual rights and the concentration of power in the hands of a few individuals.
I see. And what about Poland? How has globalization affected individual rights in Poland?
Well, in Poland, globalization has also brought new economic opportunities and investments, but it has also raised concerns about the erosion of individual rights and the concentration of power in the hands of a few individuals.
I'm curious. Leo, what do you think about the future of individual rights in Benin and Poland? Do you think that they will continue to be protected and promoted in both countries?
Well, I think it's worth noting that both Benin and Poland have made significant progress in protecting individual rights and freedoms in recent years. However, there are still many challenges ahead, including the impact of globalization and the concentration of power in the hands of a few individuals.
I agree. And what about our listeners? Do you think that individual rights will continue to be protected and promoted in Benin and Poland?
Well, I think it's worth noting that individual rights are a fundamental aspect of any democratic society. I'm sure that our listeners will continue to play an important role in promoting and protecting individual rights in both Benin and Poland.
I'm certain that our listeners living in Benin and Poland will agree with me that individual rights are essential to a healthy democracy. And what about the role of the media in promoting individual rights in both countries?
Great question. The media has played a crucial role in promoting individual rights in both Benin and Poland. In Benin, the media has been able to expose corruption and promote transparency, while in Poland, the media has been able to hold the government accountable and promote individual rights.
I see. And what about the impact of social media on individual rights in Benin and Poland?
Well, social media has had a significant impact on individual rights in both Benin and Poland. In Benin, social media has allowed citizens to express themselves and mobilize against corruption. While in Poland, social media has been used to promote individual rights and freedoms.
I'm curious. Leo, what do you think about the relationship between individual rights and economic development in Benin and Poland?
Well, I think it's worth noting that individual rights are essential to economic development. When individual rights are protected and promoted, it can lead to economic growth and development.
I agree. And what about our listeners? Do you think that individual rights are essential to economic development in Benin and Poland?
Well, I'm sure that our listeners will agree with me that individual rights are essential to economic development in both Benin and Poland.
I'm certain that our listeners will agree with me that individual rights are essential to a healthy democracy. And what about the role of education in promoting individual rights in Benin and Poland?
Great question. Education has played a crucial role in promoting individual rights in both Benin and Poland. In Benin, education has helped to promote critical.
So, when it comes to relaxation, both Benin and Poland offer unique experiences. In Benin, you can find traditional hammer messen spores that blend African and European influences. They often feature hot stones, massage, and herbal remedies to soothe the body and mind.
Yes. And in Poland, you'll find a mix of modern spas and traditional saunas. The Poles take their saunas very seriously, with some places offering Finnish-style heat and steam, while others use traditional Russian banya techniques. It's all about finding that perfect balance between relaxation and rejuvenation.
That's right. And did you know that in Benin, you can even take a traditional herbal bath infused with local plants like shea butter and aloe vera? It's like a spa treatment from another world.
Wow, that sounds amazing. In Poland, they have their own version of herbal remedies. Too, they use plants like chamomile and lavender to create soothing teas and infusions. And let's not forget about the traditional Polish sauna, where you can find a great sense of camaraderie with fellow sauna-goers.
I'm certain that our listeners living in Poland would agree with me that there's nothing like a good sauna session to clear the mind and refresh the body. But what about Benin? Have you heard about the traditional Benin in the SE practice of sacred water?
Ah, yes, I've heard about it. It's a ritual where people gather around a sacred spring or well, and they bathe in the water while praying and making offerings to the spirits. It's a beautiful way to connect with nature and the community.
Exactly. And it's not just about the physical experience. It's also about the spiritual connection. In Benin, you can find many sacred springs and wells that offer this unique experience. I'm curious, Leo, have you ever tried a traditional sauna in Poland?
Well, I have to admit, I've had my fair share of sauna experiences in Poland. But I have to say, it's always a bit of a culture shock at first. I mean, have you ever seen a group of Poles stripping down to their birthday suits in a sauna? It's quite a sight to behold.
Oh, Leo, you're such a goofball. But seriously, it's great to see people embracing their bodies and enjoying the simple pleasures in life. And speaking of simple pleasures, have you tried any of the local cuisine in Benin or Poland?
Ah, yes. The food in Benin is amazing. Have you tried their traditional dish? Mi andu? It's a delicious tomato with fish, vegetables, and spices. And in Poland, you can't go wrong with their pierogi ruski, which are basically dumplings filled with potatoes and cheese.
My mouth is watering just about it. And I have to say, the cultural attitude towards food and relaxation in Benin and Poland is quite different. In Benin, food is often a communal experience, where people gather around the table to share meals and stories.
That's so true. And in Poland, you'll find that mealtimes are often more formal, with people gathering around the table to share a meal and catch up on each other's lives. But what about the role of technology in relaxation and wellness? How do people in Benin and Poland use technology to enhance their relaxation experiences?
That's a great question. In Benin, you can find many traditional healers who use herbs and natural remedies to soothe the mind and body. And in Poland, you'll find many modern spas and wellness centers that use technology to enhance the relaxation experience, such as sound baths and light therapy.
That's so cool. And I have to say, I'm a big fan of sound baths myself. There's something about the vibrations of the sound that just melts all the stress away. But what about the impact of tourism on relaxation and wellness in Benin and Poland? How do tourists influence the local culture and practices?
That's a great question. In Benin, you'll find many traditional healers who are now catering to tourists, offering them unique relaxation experiences that blend traditional practices with modern amenities. And in Poland, you'll find many modern spas and wellness centers that are designed specifically for tourists.
That's so true. And I have to say, it's great to see people from all over the world coming together to experience the unique relaxation practices of Benin and Poland. It's a great way to promote cultural understanding and exchange.
I couldn't agree more. Leo? And I think that's a great note to end on. Thank you to our listeners for joining us on this journey through the spa, healthy living, and relaxation opportunities in Benin and Poland. Don't forget to check out our next episode, where we'll be exploring the culinary delights of these two countries.
And don't forget to try some of the local cuisine. Folks, it's definitely worth it.
I'm to dive into the opportunities for religious and spiritual needs in Benin and Poland. Both countries have a rich spiritual heritage, but they approach it in unique ways. Let's start with Benin, where voodoo is a significant part of the culture.
Ah, yes. Voodoo is a fascinating aspect of Benin's spiritual landscape. The way the people incorporate their ancestors and the spirits into their daily lives is truly remarkable. I've seen it firsthand, and it's a beautiful thing.
That's right, Leo. And speaking of beautiful things, have you ever tried the traditional Benin dish? Akara? It's a staple in many Benin households, and it's made from fermented corn dough.
Oh, Mira, you're always trying to distract me with food. But yes, I have had akara, and it's delicious. But let's get back to the topic at hand. In Benin, the voting priests and priestesses play a significant role in the spiritual lives of the people.
Exactly. And it's not just the Voodoo priests and priestesses. The entire community comes together to celebrate and honor their ancestors and the spirits. It's a truly communal experience.
That's so true. And I think that's one of the things that's unique about Benin's approach to spirituality. It's so deeply rooted in community and tradition.
I'm certain that our listeners living in Benin would agree with me. It's a beautiful way to connect with one another and with their heritage.
Absolutely. Now, let's move on to Poland, where the Catholic Church plays a significant role in the country's spiritual landscape.
Yes. The Catholic Church in Poland is indeed a powerful force. But what I find interesting is the way the Polish people have incorporated their folk traditions and superstitions into their Catholic practices.
That's a great point. Mira, the Polish people have a rich history of folk traditions and superstitions, and it's fascinating to see how they blended these with their Catholic faith.
And it's not just the folk traditions. The Polish people also have a strong sense of community and solidarity, which is reflected in their spiritual practices.
That's so true. And I think that's one of the things that's unique about Poland's approach to spirituality. It's so deeply rooted in community and solidarity.
I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Do you think that the Polish people's strong sense of community and solidarity is a result of their Catholic faith? Or is it something more?
That's a great question. Mira, I think it's a combination of both. The Catholic faith provides a framework for community and solidarity, but it's also influenced by the Polish people's folk traditions and superstitions.
That's a great point. Leo, and speaking of folk traditions and superstitions, have you ever heard of the Polish tradition of Kurosonika?
Mira, you're always trying to teach me new words. But yes, I've heard of Kurosonika. It's a type of witchcraft that's practiced in some parts of Poland.
Exactly. And it's fascinating to see how the Polish people have incorporated this tradition into their Catholic practices.
That's a great example of how the Polish people have blended their folk traditions with their Catholic faith.
I'm certain that our listeners living in Poland would agree with me. It's a beautiful way to connect with their heritage and their community.
Absolutely. And speaking of community, I think it's worth noting that both Benin and Poland have a strong sense of community and solidarity in their spiritual practices.
That's right. Leah. And I think that's one of the things that's unique about both countries. Their spiritual practices are so deeply rooted in community and tradition.
Well, that's all for this criterion. Let's move on to the next topic, the role of women in spiritual leadership in both countries.
Yes. The role of women in spiritual leadership is a fascinating topic. And I think it's worth noting that in both Benin and Poland, women play a significant role in spiritual leadership.
That's right, Mira. And in Benin, the Voodoo priestesses play a particularly important role in the spiritual lives of the people.
Exactly. And in Poland, the Catholic Church has a strong tradition of female saints and mystics, such as Saint Faustina Kowalska.
Yes. Saint Faustina Kowalska is a wonderful example of a female saint who has had a significant impact on the Catholic Church in Poland.
I'm certain that our listeners would agree with me. The role of women in spiritual leadership is a vital part of both Benin and Poland's spiritual heritage.
Absolutely. And speaking of heritage, I think it's worth noting that both countries have a rich history of spiritual and cultural traditions that have been passed down through generations.
That's right. Leo. And I think that's one of the things that's unique about both countries. Their spiritual practices are so deeply rooted in tradition and community.
Well, that's all for this criterion. Let's move on to the next topic, the role of spiritual leaders in promoting social justice in both countries.
Yes. The role of spiritual leaders in promoting social justice is a fascinating topic. And I think it's worth noting that in both Benin and Poland, spiritual leaders have played a significant role in promoting social justice.
That's right, Mira. And in Benin, the Voodoo priests and priestesses have been at the forefront of promoting social justice and human rights.
Exactly. And in Poland, the Catholic Church has a long history of promoting social justice and human rights, particularly during the communist era.
Yes. The Catholic Church in Poland played a significant role in promoting social justice and human rights during the communist era.
I'm certain that our listeners would agree with me the role of spiritual leaders in promoting social justice is a vital part of both Benin and Poland's spiritual heritage.
Absolutely. And speaking of heritage, I think it's worth noting that both countries have a rich history of spiritual and cultural traditions that have been passed down through generations.
That's right, Leo. And I think that's one of the things that's unique about both countries. Their spiritual practices are so deeply rooted in tradition and community.
Well, that's all for this criterion. Let's move on to the next topic, the role of technology in spiritual practices in both countries.
Yes. The role of technology in spiritual practices is a fascinating topic. And I think it's worth noting that in both Benin and Poland, technology is being used in innovative ways to promote spiritual growth and community.
That's right, Mira. And in Benin, the voting.
So, let's talk about social equality, respect for minorities, and diversity in Benin and Poland. I'm certain that others living in Benin would agree with me when I say that the country has made significant strides in promoting social equality.
That's true, Mira. But let's not forget that Benin still has a long way to go in terms of protecting the rights of minority groups. I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this.
Well, I think that's a great point, Leo. But what's interesting is that Benin has a strong tradition of cultural diversity. With over 40 ethnic groups living together, it's a melting pot, if you will.
Ah, yes, a melting pot. But sometimes, that melting pot can get a bit too hot. If you know what I mean. Have you seen the temperatures in Benin during the dry season?
Oh, Leo, you're such a charmer. But seriously, the cultural diversity in Benin is something to be celebrated. And I think that's true for Poland as well.
Absolutely. Mira, Poland has a rich history of tolerance and acceptance, despite the challenges it faced during World War II. And I think that's something that our listeners can learn from.
That's a great point, Leo. And I think that's one of the reasons why Poland has been so successful in promoting social equality. The country has a strong tradition of grassroots activism, with many organizations working to promote the rights of marginalized groups.
That's true, Mira. But I think it's also worth noting that Poland has a complex history when it comes to minority rights. The country has a long history of persecution of minority groups, including the Romani people.
Ah, yes. The Romani people. That's a very important topic. And I think it's something that we should talk more about in the future. But for now, let's focus on the positive aspects of social equality in Poland.
Well, I'm not sure if I can agree with that, Mira. But hey, let's keep the conversation going.
Oh, Leo, you're such a tease. But seriously, I think that's what makes this conversation so interesting. We can disagree and still have a respectful conversation.
Absolutely, Mira. And I think that's something that our listeners can learn from. We should all strive to have more respectful conversations, even when we disagree.
That's a great point, Leo. And I think it's something that we should all strive for. Now, let's talk more about the cultural celebrations in Benin and Poland.
Ah, yes. The cultural celebrations. Well, I think it's worth noting that Benin has a rich tradition of cultural festivals, including the Fête de l'Indépendance, which celebrates the country's independence from France.
That's a great point, Leo. And I think it's worth noting that Poland also has a rich tradition of cultural festivals, including the Krakow Film Festival, which celebrates Polish cinema.
Ah, yes. The Krakow Film Festival. I'm not sure if I've ever been to a film festival that's been so intense.
Oh, Leo, you're such a oafball. But seriously, the Krakow Film Festival is a great example of Poland's vibrant cultural scene.
Absolutely, Mira. And I think it's worth noting that both Benin and Poland have a strong tradition of grassroots activism, with many organizations working to promote the rights of marginalized groups.
That's a great point, Leo. And I think it's something that our listeners can learn from. we should all strive to be more active in promoting social equality and respect for minority groups.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think that's something that we can all agree on. Now, let's talk more about the challenges facing being in Poland in terms of social equality.
Oh, yes. The challenges. Well, I think it's worth noting that Benin has a long history of corruption and mismanagement, which has led to social and economic inequalities.
That's a great point, Mira. And I think it's worth noting that Poland also has a complex history when it comes to corruption and mismanagement, including the recent corruption scandal involving the Polish government.
Ah, yes. The corruption scandal. That's a very important topic, Leo. And I think it's something that we should talk more about in the future.
Absolutely, Mira. And I think it's worth noting that both Benin and Poland have a long way to go in terms of promoting social equality and respect for minority groups.
That's a great point, Leo. And I think it's something that our listeners can learn from. We should all strive to be more active in promoting social equality and respect for minority groups.
Absolutely, Mira. And I think that's something that we can all agree on. Now, let's talk more about the cultural heritage of Benin and Poland.
Ah, yes. The cultural heritage. Well, I think it's worth noting that Benin has a rich tradition of cultural heritage, including the Kingdom of Dahomey, which was a powerful and influential kingdom in West Africa.
That's a great point, Mira. And I think it's worth noting that Poland also has a rich tradition of cultural heritage, including the city of Krakow, which is a UNESCO World Heritage Site.
Ah, yes. The city of Krakow. That's a very important topic, Leo. And I think it's something that we should talk more about in the future.
Absolutely, Mira. And I think it's worth noting that both Benin and Poland have a strong tradition of cultural heritage, which is something that we should all strive to preserve and protect.
That's a great point. And I think it's something that our listeners can learn from. We should all strive to be more active in preserving and protecting cultural heritage.
Absolutely, Mira. And I think that's something that we can all agree on. Now, let's talk more about the future of social equality in Benin and Poland.
Ah, yes. The future. Well, I think it's worth noting that Benin has a strong tradition of grassroots activism, which is working to promote social equality and respect for minority groups.
That's a great point, Mira. And I think it's worth noting that Poland also has a strong tradition of grassroots activism, which is working to promote social equality and respect for minority groups.
Ah, yes. The grassroots activism. That's a very important topic, Leo. And I think it's something that we should talk more about in the future.
Absolutely, Mira. And I think it's worth noting that both Benin and Poland have a long.
So, let's dive into taxation, retirement, and social rights for long-term immigrants in Benin and Poland. Both countries have unique approaches to supporting their residents. In Benin, the tax system is relatively straightforward, with a flat rate of 25% on income.
But that's where the simplicity ends. In Poland, the tax system is more complex, with a progressive tax rate that ranges from 9% to 32%. It's like trying to solve a puzzle, but with numbers instead of pieces.
Well, I'm sure our listeners who have dealt with Polish bureaucracy can attest to that. But seriously, the tax system in Poland is designed to encourage entrepreneurship and investment.
And it's working. But it would cost. The tax burden on individuals is quite high, especially for those who earn above the average income. It's like being stuck in a never-ending loop of paperwork and calculations.
I'm sure our listeners in Poland can relate to that feeling. But let's move on to retirement and social rights. In Benin, the pension system is relatively new, but it's designed to provide a safety net for retirees.
But it's not just about the pension itself. It's about the social rights that come with it. In Poland, retirees have access to a range of benefits, including healthcare, housing, and education.
That's great to hear. But what about long-term immigrants? How do they fit into the system? In Benin, Immigrants are eligible for a pension after 5 years of residency, but the process can be quite complex.
Complex? That's an understatement. In Poland, immigrants have to navigate a maze of bureaucracy to access their pension benefits. It's like trying to find a needle in a haystack, but the needle is hidden in a pile of paperwork.
Okay. I think we've established that both countries have their challenges, but let's talk about social rights. In Benin, immigrants have access to the same social services as citizens, including healthcare and education.
But it's not just about access. It's about quality. In Poland, the social services are generally well-funded and of high quality, but the process of accessing them can be quite lengthy.
I'm sure our listeners in Poland can attest to that. But what about the tax implications of accessing social services? In Benin, immigrants are eligible for tax deductions for healthcare and education expenses.
But in Poland, the tax implications are more complex. Immigrants may be eligible for tax deductions, but the process of claiming them can be quite bureaucratic.
I think we've covered a lot of ground today, but I'm curious about what our listeners think about this topic. Do you think the tax systems in Benin and Poland are fair and equitable?
I'm sure our listeners have plenty of opinions on that topic. But seriously, the tax systems in both countries have their pros and cons. It's like trying to find a balance between simplicity and complexity.
Well, I think we found a balance of sorts. Both countries have their unique approaches to taxation, retirement, and social rights, and our listeners can attest to the challenges and complexities of navigating these systems.
I'm sure they can. But at the end of the day, it's all about finding a way to make it work. Whether it's in Benin or Poland, or any other country. The key is to be informed and prepared.
That's a great point, Leo. And I'm sure our listeners will appreciate the information and insights we've shared today. Thanks for joining us on this topic, and we'll see you in the next episode.
And don't forget to like and subscribe for more episodes like this one. We'll be back soon with another exciting topic. Until then, stay informed and stay safe.
Welcome back to our podcast, where we dive into the fascinating world of two countries and explore their unique characteristics. We're comparing Benin and Poland, and I'm to share with you the rate at which these countries meet specific interests. Leo, let's start with Benin. What do you know about this country's niche hobby clubs?
Benin. A hidden gem in West Africa. I've heard that Benin has a vibrant art scene, with numerous galleries and museums showcasing traditional and modern art. They also have a strong tradition of wood carving, which is a great example of their craftsmanship. But I'm curious, Mira, have you heard about the Benin's National Museum of Ethnography, which houses an impressive collection of traditional artifacts?
That's a great point. Leo, the National Museum of Ethnography is indeed a treasure trove of Benin's rich cultural heritage. But let's talk about Poland. I've been fascinated by the country's passion for folk music and dance. The Polish folk music scene is incredibly rich, with various regions having their own unique styles and traditions. Have you ever been to a traditional Polish folk concert? Leo?
Actually, Mira, I have. It was an incredible experience, with the energetic polka music and the lively dances that follow. I think what's even more impressive is the number of folk music festivals that take place throughout Poland every year. The country has a strong tradition of celebrating its cultural heritage through music and dance.
That's amazing. And I think it's worth noting that Benin also has a rich cultural heritage, with many traditional festivals and celebrations taking place throughout the year. For example, the annual Festival of the Yoruba people, which celebrates the Yoruba culture and traditions. What do you think our listeners would say about the cultural diversity of Benin and Poland?
I'm sure they would be impressed by the rich cultural heritage of both countries. But let's not forget about the community engagement aspect of meeting specific interests. In Poland, for instance, there are many community centers and organizations that promote folk music and dance, as well as other cultural activities. And In Benin, the government has implemented various initiatives to promote cultural preservation and community engagement.
That's a great point. Leo, community engagement is a crucial aspect of meeting specific interests. And I think it's worth noting that both countries have a strong tradition of community-based initiatives. In Benin, for example, the government has established a number of community centers and cultural institutions that promote cultural preservation and community engagement. And in Poland, there are many community-based organizations that promote folk music and dance, as well as other cultural activities.
I see what you're getting at. Mira, you're highlighting the importance of community engagement in meeting specific interests. And I think that's a great point. But let's not forget about the role of technology in facilitating community engagement. In Poland, for instance, there are many online platforms and social media groups that promote folk music and dance, as well as other cultural activities.
That's a great point. Leo, technology has indeed played a significant role in facilitating community engagement in both Benin and Poland. But let's talk about the role of niche hobby clubs in meeting specific interests. In Poland, for example, there are many niche hobby clubs that promote specific interests, such as model trains, stamp collecting, and even extreme sports.
I've heard of some of those niche hobby clubs in Poland. They're indeed a great example of how specific interests can be met through community engagement. But let's talk about Benin. I've been fascinated by the country's passion for traditional crafts, such as wood carving and pottery. And I think it's worth noting that Benin has a rich tradition of craftsmanship, with many artisans creating beautiful and intricate pieces.
That's a great point. Leo, the traditional crafts of Benin are indeed a testament to the country's rich cultural heritage. And I think it's worth noting that both Benin and Poland have a strong tradition of craftsmanship, with many artisans creating beautiful and intricate pieces. But let's not forget about the role of festivals and celebrations in meeting specific interests. In Poland, for example, there are many festivals and celebrations that promote folk music and dance, as well as other cultural activities.
I see what you're getting at. Mira, you're highlighting the importance of festivals and celebrations in meeting specific interests. And I think that's a great point. But let's not forget about the role of community engagement in promoting cultural preservation and community engagement. In Benin, for instance, the government has implemented various initiatives to promote cultural preservation and community engagement.
That's a great point. Leo, community engagement is indeed a crucial aspect of meeting specific interests. And I think it's worth noting that both countries have a strong tradition of community-based initiatives. But let's not forget about the role of technology in facilitating community engagement. In Poland, for instance, there are many online platforms and social media groups that promote folk music and dance, as well as other cultural activities.
I see what you're getting at. Mira, you're highlighting the importance of technology in facilitating community engagement. And I think that's a great point. But let's not forget about the role of niche hobby clubs in meeting specific interests. In Poland, for example, there are many niche hobby clubs that promote specific interests, such as model trains, stamp collecting, and even extreme sports.
That's a great point. Leo, niche hobby clubs are indeed a great example of how specific interests can be met through community engagement. And I think it's worth noting that both Benin and Poland have a strong tradition of community-based initiatives. But let's talk about the role of festivals and celebrations in meeting specific interests. In Benin, for example, there are many festivals and celebrations that promote traditional crafts, as well as other cultural activities.
I see what you're getting at. Mira, you're highlighting the importance of festivals and celebrations in meeting specific interests. And I think that's a great point. But let's not forget about the role of community engagement in promoting cultural preservation and community engagement. In Poland, for instance, there are many community centers and organizations that promote folk music and dance, as well as other cultural activities.
Ah, that's a great point. Leo, community engagement is indeed a crucial aspect of meeting specific interests. And I think it's worth noting that both countries have a strong tradition of community-based initiatives. But let's talk about the role of technology in facilitating community engagement. In Poland, for example, there are many online platforms and social media groups that promote folk music and dance, as well as other cultural activities.
I see what you're getting at. Mira, you're highlighting the importance of technology in facilitating community engagement. And I think that's a great point. But